If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and the public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble at Queen Victoria's statue in front of the civic offices. In order to comply with the Portsmouth Cultural Trust fire marshal regulations, please remember to sign out when you leave the building after today's meeting. Please be mindful that there is a conference taking place in the Lord Mayor's banqueting suite along the corridor, so please do not access the Lord Mayor's corridor, and for comfort breaks, please use the facilities in the basement of the Guildhall. For those of you who have not attended this committee before, I will explain the running order for this afternoon. After committee members have informed you of who they are, I will announce each item and ask those of you who are here to make a deputation to come and sit at the table or at the microphones. After the planning officer has made the presentation for the application, individual deputies will have 6 minutes to express their views, and joint deputies will have 12 minutes between them to make their views known. In the case of the first item on St. James Hospital, I intend to modify these arrangements to allow a little more time for both those opposing and those supporting the application to make their views known to the committee. After making a deputation, you will take no further part in the proceedings unless we need to ask a question to clarify a statement that has been made. Members will then ask questions, make comments, and the decision on the application will be made. Both members of the committee and members of the public are reminded of the need to consider material planning matters and not to refer any personal information about other members of the public. If they do so, I will ask them to leave immediately. May I draw everyone's attention to the fact that this meeting will be live streamed and the recording will be on the Council's website. Members of the press and public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly that they do not wish to be recorded. The cameras focused on the chair during the deputations, but those will be heard by those watching on the recording. May I finally ask everyone to use the microphones provided when they are speaking. To turn it on, you press the little button which you see, which is green on the microphones at the moment, and when you have finished speaking, please turn off. If you exceed the limit, I will turn you off. So, who are your members this afternoon? I am Councillor Hugh Mason. I am the chairman of the meeting, and I'd ask the other councillors to introduce themselves. Joe.
Councillor Joe Hooper for Paulsgrove Ward.
Councillor Gemma New, Paulsgrove Ward.
Councillor James, Hilsey Ward.
Councillor Luke Stubbs, Eastern Craigswater.
Councillor Claire UD, Charles Dickens.
Councillor Lynn Stagg, Baffins Ward.
Councillor Steve Pitt, Central Southsea.
Councillor Susie Horton, Central Southsea.
Councillor Judith Smythe, St Jude Ward and Vice Chair of the Planning Committee.
Right, thank you. I would now ask the officers who are here to support us to introduce themselves, starting with Si.
My name's Sim Manley, I'm City Development Manager.
Simon Turner, Planning Officer.
Alan Banting, Planning Officer.
Richard Lee, Regulatory Services Manager.
Peter Hayward, Highways.
Paul Barton, Assistant Director, City Development.
Michael Alder, City Solicitor.
My name's Kieran Laven, I'm the Planning Solicitor.
Thank you very much. Do we have any apologies for absence? Thank you. Do we have any declarations of members' interests? Councillor Pitt.
Yes, Chair. It's a personal but non-prejudicial and non-pecuniary interest in that I know one of the consultants who works for the applicant for the Kingston Prison application, but I'm convinced that there is no personal prejudicial issue that stops me from having a fair decision today.
Councillor Smythe.
I don't think this is anything prejudicial, but the Housing Association, Vivid, is mentioned in the Kingston Prison application, and I was until 2 years a very long-standing board member of First Wessex Group that preceded Vivid.
Thank you. Councillor Stagg.
I don't know if it's a problem, but both of these are in my ward. Both these planning applications.
That is not
I didn't think so, but I thought I'd declare it just in case.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Horton.
Like Councillor Pitt, I also have a personal but non-prejudicial interest in knowing one of the consultants for the prison application. But I consider it to be non-pecuniary.
Right, thank you very much. Right, before we proceed, last evening I received some legal advice concerning the first item and second item on the agenda concerning St James Hospital in Loxway Road. I would ask him to give the legal advice.
In relation to St James's Hospital, Loxway Road, Southsea, it states, in response to the representations being received in relation to the status of the villas on the site being curtilage listed, by reason of them being within the grounds of a listed building and predating 1948, further advice has been sought. The advice received is that the buildings in question are likely to be curtilage listed structures, and for this reason their removal would require listed building consent. For this reason, the Council is not in a position to consider the outline application in the absence of a listed building consent application, and therefore it is recommended the application be deferred until such time as the listed building consent application has been submitted and can be properly considered in conjunction with the outline planning application.
Thank you very much. Members, before putting a proposition to the committee, I will open this for comment on the issue of deferral and on the issue of deferral only. So if there is a member who wishes to speak on these matters, will they please indicate? Councillor Smythe.
Chair, I'm just really surprised about this. I went to a briefing on Monday evening. I think you came for a very short while before going on to another meeting, and I specifically asked questions about the villas and about whether they had ever been put forward for listing, and I was told categorically by planning officers that there was no question of it, and that they weren't thought to be significant enough, and that applications had been discussed, and that there was no question about them being listed. So I would be grateful to know a little bit more how things have changed within the last two days. It does seem to me an extraordinary thing suddenly to have come up at the last minute. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Pitt.
Yes, Chair. Rather like Councillor Smythe, we've known about this application. It's not a new application that's suddenly popped up over the last few weeks. It's been in the offing for a long time. I'm aware that local campaign groups in the Milton area have raised this issue historically and asked about it, and were given exactly the same response that Councillor Smythe and others were given at the Monday briefing. So it's a bit odd that we're sat in the council chamber because of the importance of two particular items for the planning committee, and it turns out that one of them is not going to be heard today in all likelihood because the advice has changed at the 11th hour and 59th minute. So I think at the very least, if it is going to be deferred, we need to apologise to the residents who've taken time out today to come here and give up their time to state and represent their views for themselves and the groups that they work with. And I think this is quite embarrassing. And if you would like to bring forward a motion for deferral, given the fact that this is legal advice, I'm happy to second it.
Councillor Stubbs.
Can I just clarify what the officer's position is on this? Because are you saying that the officer's view is that these buildings are curtilage listed, or are you saying that they may be curtilage listed and you're deferring for further information? Which one is it?
the advice that we've received is that the legal position is that they are considered to be Kirklees listed buildings.
If there are no other comments, I will propose the following to the committee. That we defer consideration of St James Hospital site for clarification and, if necessary, amendment of the application. That is proposed from the Chair. Can I have a seconder? Councillor Pitt, thank you. I put it to you that we defer. For those in favour, please indicate. Those against? Those abstaining? Thank you. I think it is incumbent upon me to make an apology to those people who have taken the effort to come along today and intended to make a deputation or to hear the deliberations of this committee. This is an unfortunate occurrence. I was not aware of it until 6 o'clock yesterday evening, and I believe that it was decided that this would be the proper course of action only late yesterday afternoon. We were therefore not in a position to advise deputies or the general public of that. So my sincere apologies to you, but we are deferring that for further consideration. Thank you. Sorry? A few minutes perhaps for people to leave. Should anybody not wish to stay and hear the second item on the agenda, which is the Kingston Prison, you may leave now, because I am now moving on to the second item on the agenda. On the second item, I am taking together both the planning application and the listed building consent application for Kingston Prison in Milton Road. If the objectors, Mr. Rod Bailey, Ms. Janet Birkinshaw and Mr. Terry Norton are available, would they please come to one of the microphones? I have the applicant agent, Mr. Richard Winsborough, who I believe is at one of the microphones, and I believe he is supported by Ms. Linda Bodin of Vivid Homes. Councillor Jeanette Smith has also stated that she wishes to make a deputation. So we start off by, can we have the officers' report on this application?
Thank you, Chairman. I'd just like to start, for completeness and for the record, by noting publicly that the applicant sent a summary document of their submissions to the members of the committee a few days ago. That has been placed on the application page on the Council's website as well. Before the presentation, just again for the record and for completeness, there is an update report in front of members. I'll just highlight what the main issues are in that. We've had a further objection comment concerning air quality. Clarification on the principle of the proposed small commercial unit in the site, clarification on the effect of Block J on the amenities of residents to the south, clarification on tree removals, clarification on traffic movements, some extra and amended conditions, confirmation of the public open space sum, which was set out in the committee report, and updates on the affordable housing review mechanism, which was also mentioned in the committee report for resolution, and ditto for the response on the NHS's request for a Section 106 contribution. So those are the matters dealt with in the update report in front of members. In terms of the presentation now, clearly this is a large application and there are myriad documents and plans and supporting statements. So I've chosen the following, which I hope will give a good overview for members and members of the public who may be watching, of the site, the surrounds and the proposals. I'm aware many members will know the site reasonably well, but of course I will still take everyone through the site and proposals. This is the former Kingston Prison, built in the late 1800s, with a large peripheral wall, prison wall, as would be expected, around the entire site and down the front onto Milton Road, 5 to 6 metres tall. Within the site, the original buildings were built in this radial form, blocks A, wing A, B, C, D and E, and the rotunda in the middle and the gatehouse. Non-original buildings are dotted around the site on this aerial photograph, this and this. They have all been removed since the last application some 2 years ago. The site is relatively flat. It has the former playing field up here, a line of cherry trees, not very significant in their own right here. And now, with the demolition of these non-original buildings, it looks like a construction site with cleared land and rubble and so on. In terms of the surrounding development, it is Grade 2 listed, of course, including the perimeter wall. The last bit of the site, which is outside the perimeter wall, is this surface level car park, which belonged to the prison as well, on Bowler Avenue. That is part of the development site. To the west is the Portsmouth Railway line, set down in a cutting with trees on either side. Further to the west is Kingston Cemetery, which is a Grade 2 listed historic park and garden, which has a couple of Grade 2 listed chapels in there as well. To the north, we have residential development on Bowler Avenue and Bowler Court here. And then on Milton Road, housing as well, family housing along here. And further to the east and south, we have other residential development in this part of central Portsmouth, including the former gatehouse converted to flats, workhouse, which is listed, and properties on Winscombe Gardens. There is a piece of open space at the front of the site here, which belongs to the City Council. It's just open amenity grass, well treed as you can see here, with what look like self-sown specimens dotted around it. There are a couple of utility cabinets and a telephone installation, and the applicant proposes to take a small part of that, as set out in the report, into the site to provide further space for some parking. Members will know the site, access and so on. St Mary's Road is two-way. There is the roundabout at the junction here. Then Milton Road is north only, one way, and it's a gyratory effectively coming back down south along Baffin's Road. The access to the site is through the gatehouse here. I've got a collection of photographs that illustrate the views of the site in and from the surrounding area. So this is looking east from within the cemetery. So you can see the historic buildings. There's the rotunda, some of the chimneys and the various wings. Clearly this view will change. This is in December, so for 6 months of the year you will get views into the site of the existing buildings and, if approved, the proposed buildings. Clearly for the other 6 months of the year those views will be fairly heavily screened by the trees and shrubs in leaf. Looking east on Bowler Avenue, so this is the car park outside the listed wall there that I mentioned earlier, which is part of the site for a 3-storey building, and there are the houses opposite. That's looking the other way. That's again the northern wall and the external car park. This is the nearest property on Bowler Court and the cemetery behind. Milton Road looking south, so against the flow of traffic. I'm sorry the photograph isn't great perhaps. Here's the listed wall, 5 to 6 metres tall, and of course the historic buildings within the site, the various chimneys, and this is the gatehouse, and you can see the housing opposite. Here's the gatehouse, decorated imposing building with the central gate. This would remain for access into the site only. This is the piece of land at the southeast corner I mentioned a couple of moments ago. There's the phone mast and some of the utility cabinets. The piece of land is more or less this area that the applicants propose to take within their site, so whatever new boundary treatment would move out onto this sort of line to provide the parking behind, and if approved with whatever boundary treatment is deemed appropriate. There's one of the small trees that will be removed. There are 3 others. Just behind me, a group of small 3 cherries. This is the other frontage on St Mary's Road, looking west to the bridge that goes over the railway line. The new access point on St Mary's Road would be in this bay, I think, or possibly the next bay, taken out to provide an in and out access for vehicular traffic with a side gate, pedestrian gate, gateway for pedestrians. There are 5 wings of the prison. Here's just one of them, C wing, the north elevation, so that's the cemetery behind. It's a fairly typical wing with a chimney there. Most of the wings have the significant roof lights lighting the communal areas down below in the centre of the building. And then this wing happens to have all high-level windows, which are typical of the cells, a small window for each cell. You'll see in a later image how this wing, for example, is proposed for change with roof lights and lowering of approximately half of the windows in order to provide proper amenity and living space for the internal flats proposed. Here is D wing inside, just one of the wings we could have chosen to illustrate typical prison interior with the shared spaces and the mezzanine upstairs. I don't think you can make them out. There's the Portsmouth symbol, which is dotted along the balustrading at regular intervals. Those sorts of details would be retained and refurbished, along with many others, of course. In most of the wings, the central corridor is retained either all or in part, at least, in significant part, depending on the arrangements of each particular wing, which are all slightly different. That's the same wing. The photograph was taken from down there. This is simply looking back down, looking away from the rotunda. There's a window at the end that would become part of a flat. Typical cells, they're small, so width from about there to there. This one happens to have a bigger window, but the ones you saw just now on the north elevation were the taller, higher sill windows only. Very thick walls externally and even internally, about 30 centimetres solid walls. So onto the site plan. Members are aware that there was a previous planning consent heard at this committee in the summer of 2016, approved with the Section 106 leave agreement some months later, I think January 2017. This scheme is largely very similar. Not exactly the same, but largely similar. The previous scheme had 230 units, this has 267. That's been achieved by typically some slight raising of stories at some locations and removal of some undercroft parking at other locations in order to get more flats in at the ground floor, and other numerous alterations, including within the listed building. But on its own merits, this application proposes the conversion of the 5 radial wings and the rotunda. Block B, which has been reduced down to the original single story, will be built up with another 2 stories to match the scale and design largely of the existing buildings, and the gatehouse here will also be converted into flats with one small either shop or cafe restaurant small unit to serve the development itself and anyone else who might like to pop in. The site on that point would be publicly accessible. The gates would not be closed, so the in-out here, the in there, this is vehicular traffic, and out there would remain open, so members of the public from outside the site could, if they wished, come in and walk the dog or have a sit down in the various open spaces proposed. The new build blocks are in the same position and essentially the same design as previously, with alterations at height. Block J here is 7 stories, as is Block K. Block L has a 3-story element here because of its closeness to Bowler Court residences. That's the same as approved, and a 6-story element slightly further away. Block M is 4-story, and Block N is 3-story, again cognizant of the smaller existing residential development. Here is the extra parking area sought, that triangle approximately there on the open space. In terms of highway changes to account for the extra traffic that the site would generate, as per the last development, apart from the new accesses, there would be ghost islands and a waiting spot incorporated in this area. A new pavement along the northern edge, there is no pavement there existing to serve the new access, and cycle route along here, along the front. And then numerous changes around the roundabout, deflecting traffic to slow it down, to channel it correctly in terms of lane discipline, cyclist safety and so on, and an extra lane created on the southbound into Milton Road to get traffic off the roundabout as soon as possible, safely. Here are some 3D images which I think are probably the best to represent the site to members. So looking south on Milton Road, here's Bowler Avenue, so the existing housing there. That's the 3-storey block N as approved. Here's the 4-storey block M and the gatehouse to the rear. There will be some parking along the landscaped front as well. Perhaps the principal view from the roundabout. Here again is block M on Milton Road, 4-storey. Here's the gatehouse, and that is block J at 7 stories. Within the site, so here you have your back to the railway line, and you're looking across to Milton Road. So Milton Road is houses are through there. So that's the 4-storey block M that faces across Milton Road. This is the 6-storey element of block L. And here is one of the wings with various amendments to the windows. You can see where some of them have been cut down lower, as I mentioned earlier. So this is an idea of the central, this is the largest open space within the site. There would be more cars parked than shown here around the periphery of the landscaped area. So this is to give members a sense of the sense of place that will be created by the development. As you've seen from the site plan in front of you, there are 2 or 3 other sizable spaces dotted around between the wings and the new buildings. Here's an illustration of some of the landscape proposals, because it's not just the quality of the architecture and the quality of the materials in the buildings and how well they are constructed, but also, of course, the quality of the landscaping that will together work to produce a place of quality, and that's what officers will work hard with the applicants to achieve. So here's just an illustrative idea of what could be achieved at one of the open spaces towards the south of the site. Again, a fair-sized site and other general areas that wrap around the buildings that will contribute to a good quality place if done correctly. Sorry, it's not a great image, but just to give you a formal 2D plan elevation of one of the blocks, that's block J. You've seen that on the street view, perhaps a more fair representation in colour and in 3D, but I just wanted to show you that for completeness. The former building was to that height on that element, and to the slightly higher height, red there, because of the slightly compressed ceiling heights they've achieved with this one. The maximum height actually drops by, I think, about ½ a metre at that point. For completeness, here is a ground floor plan of that same block. So that's St Mary's Road here and the railway line to the rear. So each block has a central core element with the entrance and lifts and stairs. On the ground floor, of course, you have the refuse areas and meter cabinets and so on, and there is one of the sizable bike stores to provide for all the residents. Here's just one of the wings that I thought would be instructive to look at. This is the same view that you had in the photograph earlier, which was the north elevation, I think, of block wing C. If you remember, all the windows were at high level in the photograph, so there you are. That's where typically the principal bedroom or living room windows are cut down through the material to produce a normal window for the occupiers to use, and in this instance there are a couple or 3 front doors created to give individual accesses into some of the flats. Others will share the communal entrances and the corridors in the typical prison layout. Again, here's just a sample. This is A, E and D wings of the sorts of conversions that go on. I don't know if that's big enough for you or not. Do say if you'd like it enlarged at all. Typically, as set out in the report, the cells are clearly too small for almost any room apart from perhaps a bathroom or toilet. So typically either 1 or 2 walls are removed to create a new room, a new and usable room. Typically The stubs of the walls will be, I think, just retained, so for historical reasons you can retain the sense of where the enclosures, where the walls used to be. But there is also plenty of fabric retained. That'll be an original wall retained where possible. There are numerous other changes within the building, removal of original and non-original, and putting in new walls as well. That is inevitable with a listed building and achieving a sensible conversion. There is the rotunda which exists in the centre. That's a key point in the middle of the building. It would have been for the prison, and it should be for this development if approved. So here you can see the extent of corridors retained. That's where we had the photographs taken earlier on. And this is the central rotunda that is full height to an impressively vaulted ceiling. Those are the same wings at first floor, for example. So here in this instance you have the full length of the wing retained there. In other ones you have elements blocked off to form flats. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now come to the deputations. I have two deputation lists of objectors. Could the people indicate that they're here? Mr. Rod Bailey, thank you. Miss Janice Birkinshaw, Miss Kimberly Barrett, Mr. Terry Norton. No? No, Mr. Terry Norton. It was withdrawn. Okay. So, objectors, you have, the three of you, you have 12 minutes between you. Use it as you wish, and I would call upon Mr. Rod Bailey to start.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, everybody. The National Planning Policy Framework clearly states for this site there is no presumption in favour of sustainable development. That's by virtue of the fact that nearby is a special protection area at Langston Harbour. What that means in effect is that whilst you have the existing planning consent that was granted about a year ago for a residential use, the fact that this is another application, the original one is irrelevant in the consideration of this, because this is an intensification of use. So what we're saying here is that we've got on an already very busy highway network going to have increased traffic flows. The applicant's transport assessment says he actually acknowledges the limitations of the roundabout, where at paragraph 642 he says the roundabout currently suffers congestion during peak periods, with queuing from junctions to the south blocking back and restricting the operation of the roundabout. In those drawings there, the planning officer showed us how improvements to the roundabout would help with the flows around the roundabout. But the reality is the roundabout, traffic on a weekday evening, traffic is queuing, this is about 5 o'clock, is queuing north of Copner Bridge, heading southwards along Milton Road to the prison site, but beyond the roundabout. So no improvements on the roundabout are going to do that, because it carries on to Milton Road, to the Velder Avenue Junction, and thereafter towards Milton Market. So none of that, those improvements can possibly affect that high traffic. In fact, arguably, the existing planning consent itself didn't properly, the conditions imposed probably didn't improve the site. And where one of the things that we do suffer in ports with is high levels of air pollution, and the consequential effect on Air Quality Management Area 9, which is just about 500 metres maybe south of that roundabout. It's Velder Avenue and Eastern Road, Milton Road. The 2016 air quality reading, which was going to be discussed in the previous application, was at 39.37 micrograms per cubic metre. That's relevant because any additional traffic only needs to increase that by 1.6%, and you're now exceeding national air quality objectives. And the national planning policy is quite clear. It does say that lost it. What it should say is that the decision makers should consider the effects of air pollution on schemes. You've got a supplementary planning document which already triggers an air quality assessment by the virtue of the fact that it exceeds 300 parking spaces. We're now getting to a state where there's 349 with the addition of these 41 units. So we have a situation where actually the council should exercise what's legally called a cautionary principle. Where it cannot be demonstrated that, this sounds a double negative, harm will not be caused by a project, it must assume that harm will be caused. So therefore, no project can go ahead without further analysis, and we haven't done it on this site. I don't believe that the road, this is personal, but I have lived in this city since 1980, and Copner Road is now much busier than it was 10, 15 years ago. And you did have that the air quality is rising, like the Burfields Road, Copner Road junction, and it's rising in Air Quality Management Area 9, as confirmed in the 2016-2017 Air Quality Strategy. So I think this development, as it stands, actually creates a situation where we could get to unlawful, I repeat that word, unlawful levels of pollution. Thank you.
May I distribute?
Certainly, Ms. Birkinshaw. Anything you distribute does become the property of the council.
Thank you for that. I've come along today because, although I'm chair of Milton Neighbourhood Forum, this development naturally affects us as we are adjacent neighbours. I did object to the previous application because the traffic would affect us, and as Rod has already pointed out, we are very concerned about the levels of air pollution that there have been and remain in the Velder Avenue area. So I'm simply distributing to you pictures of the Loxway Road roundabout. This is one that affects movement in and around Milton as people come out from the many roads to the east of Loxway Road and meet up with the traffic coming south and also going north. Many of the people using or living in the prison from the previous and this suggested development will use that route. I merely come to say we feel we've reached saturation point and that the levels proposed for the additional occupation are unsustainable. I add to that the recent headlines, which we've all seen only this week, about the very poor performance of Queen Alexandra Hospital, despite every attempt that they have made to improve A&E, and it seems to the layperson there are simply too many people allocated to that hospital. And I also draw your attention to this. The Copner Road Powers Court surgery is in a highly polluted area, and also the Hannaway Road, which is just up from St Mary's Road as you approach Kingston, that both those doctor surgeries are operating in the areas of highest air pollution in the city. The people who will come to live in this new development will most probably gravitate towards those doctor surgeries and will also, as an alternative, have the choice of the worst performing doctor's surgery in the city, which has been highlighted in the Baffins area. So I believe that the word unsustainable would apply to this development. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Barrett.
Thank you. I just want to say that Keep Milton Green's original objection has not really changed at all, and I personally still believe that it was a huge mistake regarding giving planning permission for the prison to be developed into these shoebox dwellings almost. That's what was described to me by a resident anyway. As Rod and Janice have pointed out, the National Planning Policy Framework revolves around the fact that developments must be sustainable. However, I find it increasingly difficult to believe that this development in itself would be sustainable, let alone supporting the current infrastructure of the area, which we know from what people have been saying here, really does already have issues. To add on to Janice's point, the closest doctor's surgery is that of East Shore Partnership, which is literally not even 5 minutes away, and this practice is split between Baffins surgery and a surgery on the edge of St Mary's Hospital. With this surgery, which is my own surgery, it's a well-known fact that it's extremely difficult to get a doctor's appointment there. What we have to do is we phone up and then wait a few days for a call back to assess whether we actually need an appointment, and then we have to wait a few weeks if it's deemed necessary to see a doctor. The surgery, as Janice has pointed out itself, was rated as the worst in the city, with a 38.8% rating of how satisfied the patients actually are there. Add to this the fact that QA Hospital has been on black alert a significant amount of times every year for a number of years, shows that there is a huge problem in the city. It is in no way, though, the healthcare professionals' fault, but it's in fact a fundamental fault, the pressure that national government are putting on house building targets, as well as cuts to councils and their vital services across the city as well. To further support this fact, I'm sure you would have seen that the NHS itself has put in a letter stating that they are currently operating at full capacity. It is literally one of the first things they say in the letter. Also, they state, and this is directly from them, that the development directly affects the ability to provide the health service required to those that live in the development and the community at large. Without the contribution, the development is not sustainable and should be refused. That in itself is pretty damning evidence. It shows that the current infrastructure cannot cope, let alone adding a further 200 plus homes in this development, without considering other large-scale developments, obviously like St James, which has been deferred today, and others across the city. The NHS is blatantly crying out that they are at capacity and have felt the need to speak out, so surely that speaks volumes. And as I've found when I've come to planning, I've found that it's extremely rare that they would take the decision to send this letter to you. Add to that fact that functions in the area, in the area are near or at capacity. When we've done the traffic survey in Milton, the junctions surrounding the areas were near or at capacity, and that was a few years ago. And also, because of these traffic problems and the idling cars, that also adds to further health issues which impacts on QA and doctor's surgeries. Previous documents submitted stated that the developers believe there would only be a 0.5% increase in air pollution, but I find that extremely hard to believe when you constantly sit there in idling traffic or walk by from down towards Southsea right up to Copner and further. This is going past the site, and what with it being close to AQMA zones that are, in real trouble, it's going to cause a real problem adding this significant amount of housing on top. This alone should be refused purely on the grounds that the NHS is struggling to cope, as well as other issues with the traffic in the area, the air quality, Section 106. I still think there's something not quite right about that as well, and I really believe that that should all be considered and then also therefore decide to refuse this planning application. Thank you.
Thank you. We now come to the agent and supporter. Mr. Winsborough and Ms. Monan, you have 12 minutes between you.
It's actually going to be just myself speaking.
In which case, sir, you have 6 minutes.
I wasn't going to be able to fill the 12, don't worry.
Yes? Yes, I know. She can't, it is our normal practice that councillors speak last, whether they are in favour or against. I have her on my list. Thank you. Right, you have 6 minutes.
Good afternoon, councillors. My name is Richard Winsborough, and I head up the City and Country planning team. And I've had the privilege of working on this site since purchasing it in 2015. I'm here today with Linda Bonin from Vivid Homes, who is here to answer any questions you may have. I'm not going to waste your valuable time by repeating items from the comprehensive report produced by your officers, but instead would just like to cover a few key areas. As a company, we're passionate about our work to conserve and restore historic and listed buildings. However, the work we do is rarely achievable without having to face complex challenges to ensure that the vision of a project can be delivered. Councillors may recall that the previous residential scheme for the prison site was the subject of a jointly appointed independent viability assessment, which identified there was a substantial deficit on the site in the region of £17 million. On this basis, the Council agreed that the scheme could not provide affordable housing via the traditional Section 106 route, and that it was clear that we would need to explore ways to help reduce the deficit so the site could be delivered. One of the options we started talking to officers and councillors about in May 2018 was the potential to provide a greater density of development on site by increasing storey heights, reconfiguring the ground floor of the new build element and amending the cell block layout. These discussions were on the basis that any amended scheme retained the principles of the approved scheme and focused the changes to the least sensitive areas of the site. After receiving positive feedback from officers, we worked on finalising a revised scheme for the site, which culminated in the proposals presented before you today. We've worked closely with officers throughout the planning process and are pleased that they have recommended their full support for an equally high quality development which delivers a further 37 new homes. Whilst the majority of the additional homes will be provided in the new buildings, the revised scheme is not just about the new build elements, it also provides the opportunity for a more sensitive conversion of the main prison building, which will result in a reduction of interventions and a greater reuse of the historic fabric. We're also introducing front doors to the ground floor apartments along the prison wings, which will allow residents direct access from their apartment to the outdoor space. The revised scheme maintains the fundamental aspects of the approved scheme for the site. A few examples include the 5 new buildings located in the same positions, the key design principles remain unchanged, and the agreed entrances on St Mary's Road, Milton Road remain the same and continue to be supported by the highways engineer. The landscaping scheme maintains the same principles with extensive new tree planting across the site. We've been working with Vivid Homes on their requirements for the new build elements of the development to ensure that apartment sizes meet their requirements and also conform to the national space standards. In terms of highways and car parking, the Council's highways engineer is satisfied that the local roads can accommodate the extra traffic movements that are expected as a result of the additional residents, subject to the same highways improvement package being delivered, which is focused on the roundabout, and this has been agreed with officers. The air quality officer is also satisfied that the positive conclusion of the original air quality assessment still applies. Vivid Homes has confirmed that 1 parking space for each of their apartments would be adequate for their needs, which means the remaining 160 plus parking spaces are available for visitors and the remaining 84 apartments. This also means it's extremely unlikely there'll be any overspill of car parking onto surrounding roads. In respect to the viability position, Savills have been reappointed jointly with the Council to independently assess the viability of the revised scheme and has reported that the new scheme has a reduced deficit to approximately £11 million, which is as expected. Now, this is clearly a significant step in the right direction, and we're now delighted to be working with Vivid to help deliver this important scheme. We continue working hard in the background to try and reduce the deficit further, and if these revised proposals are supported by the committee today, we'll be working to make sure that a swift start on site can be made. We have discussed and agreed heads of terms on the new Section 106 with officers. Solicitors have been instructed and are actively working on the draft document, which we hope will be completed in March, subject, of course, to your support today. I want to finish by reassuring members that there is a real drive to make this development happen, and with Vivid Homes committed to the delivery of 183 of the new build apartments as affordable homes, it's clear that these revised proposals present the opportunity for far-reaching benefits for Portsmouth. As I previously mentioned, Linda from Vivid Homes is here to show commitment to the delivery of the new build homes as affordable, and I know that she'll be happy to answer any questions you have. We hope you're able to support our proposals. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to listening to the debate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wisborough. Councillor Jeanette Smith, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me this chance to speak on Kingston development at this planning meeting. I'm not too sure about the last word. I think sometimes we say too much, but, you know, that's fine. Some points in might not be about planning considerations, but I actually feel it needs to be said. We are very much at a crossroads in developing this city, and there are certain issues we can no longer ignore when considering plans to develop, hence why I'm here objecting to the proposals of Kingston Prison. It is not, and I repeat, not, however, in regards to the social housing part of the development, and I have long campaigned on how much this is needed in the city, and I welcome Vivid to the development. However, this development comes at a cost to the infrastructure of the area, and the assumption that the traffic impact will only be increased by 18 movements is not only short-sighted but misleading. And I note that the associated papers have said it's now on top of the 97 already reported in the first development. However, it is clear the first part of this development, which received planning permission in 2017 for 230 flats, has not been taken into account. There are other developments in the area. Moneyfields has already been agreed, St James's has been deferred, and now this expanded application at Kingston. 18 movements with this new application is an underestimation on the impact, and it's a standalone figure for this development. It should be taken into correlation with neighbouring Milton and Baffin's developments. There needs to be a proper coordinated traffic assessment before permission is granted, as this will generate traffic issues across the area and is one of the main arteries for commuting out of the city to join the M275. St Mary's Bridge is an accident waiting to happen. Anyone travelling down St Mary's Road knows this is a blind spot, and to put an exit from this development without necessary consideration is irresponsible, and I do not particularly want to come to this committee where there is a fatal accident to say I told you so. Just painting white lines will not be adequate enough, especially as the only exit for large vehicles will be near the bridge. This needs to be reconsidered as a matter of urgency. NHS have already highlighted the impact on GP surgeries within the planning report. The situation for local people trying to get appointments at East Shore practice, even with 2 sites, is already at breaking point. This development will only exacerbate the problem further, and there needs to be consideration on the impact on services in the area with this development. Air quality within this city is already in parts at dangerous levels. Milton Road and Copner Road already suffer high levels of traffic pollution, which will increase the problems many residents suffer and make PCC more non-compliant than ever, and you've already heard from deputations on that. Considerations need to be made now on how we as councillors alleviate the issues and make the air we breathe cleaner. This now needs to be included in housing developments and the subsequent impact on air quality. The design of the buildings are not in keeping with the development itself, although I would not like to see student Lego buildings. I believe the plans could have been more pleasing on the eye and become more in keeping with the listed building. I also have concerns on part of the development overlooking Bowler Avenue and facing Milton Road as too high for that side of the development. It would have been excellent to see eco-friendly buildings as part of the green agenda, which would be fit for the future and lead the way on smart homes. Square blocks of concrete feel bland, and more could have been done to refresh the area. So, for example, utilise the roof space with greenery, solar panels, even living walls, so the development is carbon neutral. Section 106 was secured for contributions for off-site public open space and was given to Kingston Rec as part of their development. However, the nearest open space is Tamworth Park, and it's clear that provision should have been made for the Section 106 monies to be given to the ward where the Kingston development is situated. The planning report, page 62, 5th paragraph, highlights the fact, and I quote, Kingston Rec is now completed and so has no need for the Section 106 money. It goes on to state that it is only right and proper that P036 postcode benefit from what is the biggest development in this postcode for the foreseeable future. Baffin ward councillors should be informed and consulted on where this money within the ward is allocated to. I look forward to those discussions, especially as part of this planning is to lose some green space by St Mary's Road roundabout, and as ward councillors we can improve the green spaces remaining. Thank you for your time, and I hope some of this deputation is taken into account in your deliberations on this planning application, as with other deputies that have come today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Smith. Before we move to members' questions, at the urgent request of one member, there will now be a 5-minute adjournment.
Kingston Cruising Don asked the question about health. He's very good, Kieran. Okay. Camera's on.
Right. If our legal officer would care to return, we will. Members, you have heard the deputations, you have heard the presentation. We now come to members' questions. Councillor Udi, followed by Councillor Stagg. Councillor Udi, please.
Hello, could officers just clarify over Mr. Bailey's deputation there about the cautionary principle, please?
Thank you, Councillor. This site is located well away from the harbours, so there is no predicted direct impact on habitat matters in the harbours, for birds in particular. The impact that our whole policy process worked up with Natural England is the indirect impact of extra population. So the principle is that extra population, whether it be one house or 267 dwellings, should any or some or all of those people be down at the harbours, recreation purposes of one sort or another, there may be an impact on the birds, a direct impact when they get there rather than from the actual site itself. And so the agreed strategy and policy is that is mitigated by the Bird Aware programme. So there is a calculation. In this instance, this development would yield £121,000, I think it was, which pays for campaigns, signs, and wardens, and a myriad other measures, education, that seek to mitigate the indirect effects of people coming off-site and possibly disturbing birds elsewhere. So for an application like this, and many other applications, we go through the appropriate assessment approach, and that is done in accordance with the regulations.
Any follow-up, Councillor Udi, to that one? No. Okay. Councillor Stagg, then followed by Councillor Jones.
Thank you, Chair. I'm seriously worried about the exit and entrance into St Mary's Road, and I would like to know what exactly the developers are planning to do to mitigate against the inevitable dangers. And I'll quote, Councillor Smith said, she used the term an accident waiting to happen. Councillor Sanders and I met with both City and Country and Vivid on October the 19th last year, and I asked about this exit and entrance on St Mary's Road, and my parting words were, it's an accident waiting to happen. Well, at 3:15 that afternoon, as I was going home along St Mary's Road, I was the accident that actually happened. I came over the bridge, which is completely blind, and there was a massive queue in front of me because nobody could get onto Milton Road. I slammed my foot on the brake, and I just managed to stop probably an inch, maybe 2 inches at the most away from the car in front. But the Mercedes Sprinter delivery van behind me, doing 26 miles an hour, couldn't. Went straight into the back of me, pushed me into the back of the car in front, and wrote off my car. I had to hammer to get out of the door. Now, fortunately, I wasn't injured, and I think purely simply because I was braced, because I was my foot was on the brake. But if it hadn't been, goodness knows what would have happened. I mean, I couldn't get anything, couldn't open any doors at all. So that is something that could happen at any time. It wasn't just the one-off. I use that route every single day. Either by car or by bus, because my bus route comes along there as well. And the number of near misses there have been, because cars come over that bridge very fast when there's not a lot of traffic there. When there's more traffic, obviously it's slower, but then you come over that bridge and you've only got a short distance. And where you're planning to put that exit and entrance is directly opposite where exactly next door to where I had the accident. So what I want to know is, are they prepared to look again at that? Because it is, as Councillor Smith said, I don't want to come here or be around at any time when a fatal accident does occur there because of that, and it can happen at any time, particularly on a Saturday afternoon when Pompey are playing at home, because Milton Road is completely chock-a-block, and so the cars along St Mary's Road will be backed up. So that's my question. What are they going to do about it?
Well, I would ask the traffic officer first of all to respond, and then if there is an additional response to your specific question from the applicant, we will ask him to make a response.
Hello, hopefully I'll be able to help explain all of that. The scenario that you describe is an existing situation where we have a significant queue from the roundabout back to all that railway bridge, and there isn't then adequate stopping sight distance as you're coming over the railway bridge to the back of the queue. And the consideration that we need to give is whether or not this development worsens the problem, the likelihood of that happening. The new access in itself complies in every respect with all technical design standards, the position of the access and the visibility achievable from it. You need a 47 metre stopping sight distance when emerging from a new access, and to the brow of the bridge we've got nearly 100 metres. So the introduction of the new access in itself shouldn't cause a problem. The previous consent, which establishes the baseline against which we must assess this application, so we're not assessing it against the current position on the highway, we're assessing it against the position that would exist if the previous application was implemented. That previous application included improvements to the roundabout that mitigated the effect of the additional traffic movements likely to come from that development, such that that queue didn't get longer as a result of that development. It improved capacity at the roundabout marginally, and consequently the queue back towards the bridge was not found to get longer. This proposal, when assessed against that context, introduces an extra 18 trips in the PM peak hour. Now, of those trips, 60% of them are vehicle trips, the others are walking trips or bus trips. So that's an extra 12 trips in the peak hour, or one every 6 minutes. The guidance that we have to work with explains that where you are generating less than an extra 30 vehicle trips in an hour, so less than one every 2 minutes, that can't be considered to be a material consideration, can't be a material impact. So when you consider the effect of this development using the consented development as a baseline, it doesn't generate enough traffic for that to be a material consideration.
Can the applicant add to that any material matters to that?
No, absolutely not. That's a very comprehensive answer.
Thank you.
Can I follow up on that, Councillor Mason, please?
Certainly.
Have you considered the fact that vehicles coming out of the development will be waiting to get in? If there's a queue of traffic along St Mary's Road, they'll be waiting because they have to give way. So the time that it takes for a vehicle to come out, you could have had more vehicles coming behind on St Mary's Road.
So I'm not sure I'm understanding the question particularly well. I'm saying the improvements at the roundabout that were secured as part of the previous application and form part of this application improve traffic flow through that roundabout such that the queue on St Mary's Road doesn't get longer.
But but you can't improve movement on the roundabout significantly because there's only one lane to go north. The second lane is to turn right into Langston Road. So, and if you've got a stream cars, as you have on match days, coming up, they'll be queued back right down to where Mrs. Birkinshaw mentioned, way back by Velder Avenue, past that. So you'll have a queue, constant queue. So you're not going to reduce the amount of traffic coming up there, and you have to give way to the right if you're coming along St Mary's Road. So if you've got vehicles coming out of the development, all right, turning either right or left, they have to be let in by the traffic on St Mary's Road. That can cause further pile-up behind you on St Mary's Road if that road is busy, which it usually is on match days because people will be travelling along there from Fratton Park.
So I understand exactly what you're saying. Crystal clear on that. What I'm trying to explain is that this development, once assessed against the baseline established by the other consent, does not generate any, well, only generates an extra movement every 6 minutes in the peak hour, which we cannot consider to be a material impact. Now, I agree with you entirely. The queue on that traffic on St Mary's Road, extending back in close proximity and often over the bridge, in itself creates a dangerous situation for drivers approaching that bridge. They won't have adequate forward visibility, and there will be rear shunt accidents happening there, as you yourself found. What I'm saying is, this development, when considered against the baseline established by the previous consent, will not make that materially worse, and certainly not to a point that we could justify refusing the application on that basis.
Councillor Jones, followed by Councillor Stubbs.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I've got two questions, if I may, please. The first one is regard a point that's come out of the deputation from the applicant that talks about Portsmouth City Council and the owner of the site having jointly appointed Savills. Why?
Well, since this is Portsmouth City Council is party to this, can I have a response, please?
The approach was the same as taken, well, 2.5 years ago. Not many officers here were involved with that application at the time, so I don't have that historical knowledge as to what that arrangement the applicant might have, Chairman, if you wanted to ask. I don't think it's a problem necessarily in that it is a joint appointment. There are clear terms of reference which set out, importantly, due diligence and independence of that appointment, and everything has to be agreed through the independent surveyor. Personally, having seen lots of appraisals over the years, not the development appraisal of the applicants, but the independent surveyor's appraisal, I think it's been a very good one, very clear and open, and I've been personally satisfied that they have probed and tested everything you would expect them to and explained it all very well in their report, and then in discussions I've had with the surveyor on top of that to make sure I've understood everything. All my questions have been answered very fairly and clearly, I thought. So it was a joint arrangement historically that's been pulled through to this time, but I think it's open and transparent, and I have every confidence that the advice we had was entirely independent.
For what purpose was the City Council jointly commissioning Savills? What was it for, master planning? Or, you know, there's no reference in the report. So as members of the City Council, I think we need to understand fully before we're making a decision on an application which we are legally involved in some other way that is not transparent in the report. I feel extremely uncomfortable about this. I do still have another question on another theme as well, please.
Well, we'll get the answer to this question, and then I will certainly come back to you.
It's an independent assessment. The fact that it was joint commissioned as opposed to singly commissioned, I don't see makes any difference. I don't know, I don't have that history as to why that decision was taken.
what I'm trying to get is this viability? Is it master planning for our local plan? I understand what the joint commissioning is about, and I understand there's independent surveyors. What I want to know is what the purpose of that was. Was it for the local plan rewrite, in other words, part of an SPD? Was it for the viability testing? I need to understand what it was for.
Thank you, Councillor, for clarifying. It was purely for this one discrete planning application.
Thank you very much. On to my second question. It relates to a point on page 60 under the title of Head of Community Housing. And I think it's really important for members of the committee today, and also for members of the public and those that actually aren't here but may read about this in the press afterwards, that what we are being asked to do today is to approve a large-scale planning application, as we've heard from Councillor Stagg, you know, in this area. This will, or maybe Councillor Smith, one of the largest planning applications that's likely to come forward in that particular area, with no social housing requirement at all. And that's because it explains here that there is a application that's been made to Homes England from Vivid Homes and the owners jointly, which I understand. However, if that application to Homes England, which by the way are massively oversubscribed in terms of grant applications, if that application for funding for social housing to the owners and Vivid, or Vivid, whoever received the money directly, fails, we are effectively granting a permission today for 267 private dwellings with no requirement whatsoever for social housing. And the whole point of the change in policy some 10 or so years ago was to make sure that we have sustainable mixed developments going forward. So you don't have large council estates, large private estates, so you have mixed and balanced communities, which I think is the right way forward. I'm concerned, taking away the loss of 18 million, 11.6 million, whatever, we haven't got enough detail on that to pass over the requirement for social housing today on viability testing. Therefore, I'm very concerned that we will effectively, unless this can be addressed in a condition that doesn't negate the grant application, we are effectively giving a planning application permission today, if we grant this, for 267 private dwellings with no social housing requirement at all. That really, really worries me.
So the question is, how can we ensure that there is a proper mix and that will include affordable housing?
Thank you, Councillor. Of course, affordable housing is council policy, as you rightly point out. The previous application on the viability assessment could not afford to make a contribution for affordable housing because it was some 18 million pounds under. The applicant has brought forward a new application which has a different set of circumstances. It's 2 years down the line, more development. Therefore, the viability has been improved, but still way under break even. So that's been assessed by the surveyor and has been agreed as a true position of a market condition. Now, your concern, I think, is to make sure that if affordable housing can't be provided by the development, what happens, that is where the review mechanism comes in. As is common with any large development that will take some time to build out, this will be 3 years construction to completion and 4 years until the programmed last sale. So that's a long period of time across a big site. Lots of things can happen in the construction and housing market in that time, and it's 267 units. Things can change quite a lot for any number of reasons. That is why, for a big development, where there's a lot of sensitivity, where if costs change just slightly, that can have quite a bit of impact on the final viability, and sales values, those are the two biggest variables, can change. So it is common for a local planning authority with a development of this size and duration in construction and sales to attach a review mechanism. So as the development goes through in stages and at final review, at each stage, the actual sums are known. At the moment it's a projection. These are the projected costs over this period and these are the projected returns through the period at the end. But as you actually go through the development, you actually get real sums of money, known sums of money, and at completion you get the final reckoning. And at that stage, if the scheme has become viable beyond a certain point, then affordable housing would have to be realised. If it's still not viable, then it's correct that there is no affordable housing. So I hope, Councillor, I'm answering your question, that there is a review mechanism that would secure affordable housing should it be possible.
Which condition is that in the writing?
It'll be in the Section 106 legal agreement, which is normal.
Can I defer to Kieran on this? I mean, it's Michael Law indicating I did start a conversation with Kieran earlier, but I think some legal clarification on this, because, you know, that I appreciate that's the principle. Thank you, that's very helpful. But, you know, the point that the planning officer started off with was saying that this has been assessed by a surveyor and the viability has been satisfied that this site doesn't make a profit. Well, again, as I said in my question, I have an issue with that if that's the basis upon which we are basing our decision, because we're not being asked to decide that today about mitigating viability. We're being asked to give permission with no social housing requirement on the basis that a grant application may be granted. So the Section 106, we don't have the Section 106 wording in front of us. Therefore, I need to be satisfied that this council has covered belt and braces for our community, that this site could not be delivered as 100% McCarthy and Stone retirement flats, for example.
Right, thank you, Councillor. You are on the correct lines in terms of directing yourself to this application. The application before you is one for 100% private sector housing, and that is a position that's forced because of the position with viability. It's held that it cannot sustain affordable housing. However, within the Section 106 agreement, there is provision, as Simon has indicated, for reviews to be undertaken so that if the development were to suddenly turn a profit over a certain level, an amount of that profit would be taken as an affordable housing contribution.
I'm sorry, Councillor Mason, I've got another question from that then. Okay, I take that, and that so the Section 106 will cover it should there be a profit. So in which case then, what we're being asked today to consider if we approve this based on this grant that may or may not happen is actually back to viability. Where's the information? We haven't had a briefing on that. I can't possibly vote on this today because, you know, the fact that there was going to be a loss of 11.5 million on the previous application and now, or the other way round, and now a loss of 18, you know, a huge amount of money. Now, I met with these developers when they were forced to take this site when they bought the other prison in Bristol, wherever it was, and they didn't really want Kingston, and I fully understand why. And I remember talking to them about the numbers at that point. I'm going back 3 or 4 years ago now, and when you take on board the fact that they kind of got this one as they didn't pay a huge amount for it, they got this because they actually wanted the other one, and the MOJ said you have to take this one as well. When you take on board that principle, we are building new blocks here. Yes, there is a conversion of an existing of the prison bit, which is a bit clunky. There's some demolition which has taken place of the newer bits on the site, but the remainder of it is actually new construction. A loss of 18 million. I'm sorry, I'm not seeing it. Loss of 18 million, we know after the 20% developer's profit. So if this is actually about viability for the Section 106 via the back door, I need to see the viability. I can't possibly vote on this today legally, and I don't think that, I hope that my colleagues would support me, because I think this is really about viability today then, and I want to see the figures, because I'm not buying those figures at all whatsoever.
Would you comment on that, Kieran?
The council has obtained professional opinion from independent, reputable surveyors, and you're entitled to rely upon that professional opinion. Now, if you wish to look behind that, there's a question around whether, frankly, members are best suited to do that. It is a highly complex technical document.
Second, we've got precedent here. Councillor Pitt. Sorry to, not use my finger, but sorry, Chairman, through you.
Yes, can you ask it as a question at this point?
Last year, onto planning committee, I remember there was a big case and there was a precedent set whereby we said where we had to rely on viability testing for the negation of social housing, this committee would be fully briefed in advance. I think we've made our positions extremely clear on that. And I think that this has led us down the garden path. We've got people sat here interested, yet more waste of public time and money. We should have had this information here. It was obvious we were going to ask these questions. It doesn't take a genius to work it out. This is about money. It's about the requirement to adhere to both national planning policy and our local planning policy, and you have failed to give us the correct information to make the decision today. I would have liked to have had the information from the surveyor. Whether members understood it or not is actually our decision, and that's for us to go and understand it if we don't. But certainly, if this is about money, we should have had a briefing on the viability of this scheme beforehand.
Are you therefore proposing at this stage that there should be a deferment because any other questions will not have substance unless we are aware of the financial implications?
Yes, obviously I know you've got other people that have indicated to speak, but yes, I mean, unless you can provide me with documentation today and give me time to absorb and understand the numbers, yes, I would be proposing a deferral, because I don't think committee members today are in a position to be able to make a decision based on financial viability for the negation of social housing. I think it would be completely irresponsible, and actually maybe even against national planning policy, which illegal is the wrong word because it's not a crime per se, but I think it could be subject to a judicial review.
Thank you for that. I propose, despite the advice I have been given, that we should continue with substantive questions so that we understand the application fully, and then I will come back to you to propose the deferment. Councillor Stubbs, then Councillor Smythe. Councillor Smythe.
The first planning committee I ever attended, we in fact looked at the viability for the previous scheme, and I must say I was surprised not to see it referred to more in more detail on this, Councillor Jones, so I think that's interesting. Can I ask my other little one? My other question is, I wondered if the applicants could be conditioned to provide electric charging points. It's ideal on a new development like this for electric cars, and I share the concerns that have been expressed by the various deputations about the need to address air quality. It'd be very cheap to do it at this stage, but very expensive to do it later.
Can I have advice on that, whether it would be possible to make that a condition?
Councillor, on the electric vehicle charging points, yes, of course, that's a perfectly good idea. I'm not sure if we put that in the travel plan or elsewhere, but we'll certainly find a place for that, either in a condition or as part of the 106.
Councillor Stubbs, then Councillor Pitt.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. So firstly, during her deputation, Councillor Smith made reference to the public spaces 106 agreement, and she said that it related to particular sites only, and there were some questions about how flexible that is. Obviously, we don't have the 106 agreement in front of us, but can you provide any assurance that if there's been a change of circumstance, such as works on the particular park have been finished, that there's enough flexibility in that 106 agreement to let officers or cabinet make alternative provision?
Thank you, Councillor. Yes, I was very careful to make sure that happens, because if you tie yourself down to one project, something can go wrong, and then we don't want to have to revisit the issue. Yeah, so we've got that in the SMAT report, flexibility for Baffin's Pond and/or other public open spaces in the Baffin's ward, which there are numerous. So I think there should be plenty of flexibility there.
Okay, my next question is about the red lines for this application, because the application, you've got a car park area shown outside of the perimeter of the prison, on what to my understanding, is still council-owned land. How does that relate? I understand there's a separation between land ownership and planning, but does the applicant have reasonable certainty that were permission to be granted, has the council with another hat on agreed to permit the car parking on the land if planning permission is granted?
No certainty, Councillor. It's a separate process, so I hope I've dealt with that in the report, where I've provided the parking that would be provided, or set out the number of parking that would be provided, including that piece of land, were the applicant to secure the use of that land separately with another part of the City Council. If it weren't to secure that, we've also rehearsed the lower percentage, 122% parking, if it doesn't obtain that, and we've assessed both parking levels, and we have deemed that, recommended that both are acceptable. So whether or not they gain the use of that land, the recommendation is that the application is still acceptable in terms of parking.
Right, okay. And to go back to Councillor Stagg's debate about St Mary's Road, I was a little surprised when the officers said that it all comes down to whether there's 30 additional vehicle movements per hour, because this is, while it's true there has been a previous planning consent, I mean, there's surely got to be something in planning law to stop applicants under a different circumstance, maybe salami slicing an application, so you have 29 and another 29 and another 29. So there's got to be something about that. Surely it can't, I mean, surely there's got to be of some relevance that the consented scheme from 2016 has not been implemented.
Thank you, Councillor. I had that very same discussion with Mr. Hayward some months ago when this application came in. We're not in that position. This is the first application done for genuine reasons. I wouldn't. So really, it's a hypothetical question. I think you're asking. There would become a point where you would have to say yes. Really, how far are we going to look back, and really, what is the cumulative or the total difference? But we're not in that position with this application. So this has just been one extra change made. I think for normal reasons.
Councillor Stubbs.
I do have a few other questions, but if other members have indicated, I'm quite happy to drop out and come back in.
Councillor Pitt, then followed by Councillor Stagg, and then we'll come back to you.
That decision's out of your hands. And mine. Okay, I think, Gemma, you might have been here last time we heard this as well, weren't you? Yeah. But I think there's only Councillor Gemma, you and myself who sat on this application the first time it came before the committee in its previous guise. And on that occasion, I voted against it. And I voted against it because the economic viability assessment was presented in the meeting. We had a few minutes to look at it, and then it was whistled off again, never to be seen again, and that was what actually led to a huge debate amongst councillors about economic viability assessments. That report, as I understand it, was co-commissioned by the City Council and Savills. Is that correct, Simon? And yes, and sorry, and the applicant with Savills.
That's correct.
Okay, so I understand that on this occasion, for consistency, the same approach was taken in that the City Council and the applicant jointly commissioned Savills to do the economic viability assessment. Is that correct?
That's correct. It was important to maintain the level of knowledge with the same consultants, individual consultants at Savills were able to see through the second appraisal with the good background.
Okay. I take on all the concerns of Councillor Jones today, and I have exactly the same concerns, but with one caveat. If we reject this application today, we have an extant application for 230 definitely private units on the site. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Darren, I don't need a running commentary. Okay, thank you, Simon. So, in terms of the difference between the application that's already, and I do feel like I'm in a little bit of a time warp today, because I sat here like 3 years ago saying how bad this was and that we didn't have the viability and we weren't clear about it, and now we got a complete reverse situation where suddenly everyone's concerned about the viability, so it's a bit confusing for me. But the document that we had in front of us on that occasion, that would have been not publicly minuted, but was a recorded document that we all saw, said that it was 18 million in deficit, and am I right in saying that you're going on the record by saying that that document now says that it's 11 point whatever it is in deficit?
Well, it's not the same document, it's a new appraisal for a new development, but yes, that's changed from 18 with the previous scheme. A new scheme 2 years down the line is showing minus 11 million.
Okay. Can we hear from the people we haven't heard from yet, are sat over there in the applicant's part of the room? Can we hear, please, from Vivid about the implications of that? Because my concern is this: if we turn this down today, what effect will that potentially have on the relationship between the applicant and the potential deliverer of affordable social housing on the site? Because we could end up with an end to that relationship and 230 private units on the site, which is what none of us want. We all want there to be affordable or social housing. So I do think that in interests of fairness, since that was an offer that was made earlier on, that we ask them what happens, because I'm going to feel really bad if, and I agree with you about the viability, and officers are remiss in not bringing that report to us. I wasn't able to attend the briefings, so I wasn't aware that the viability hadn't been shown, because that is our policy and it should have happened. However, I would like to know whether any member of the committee had previously requested it and not been shown it, because that's also a pertinent point. But can we hear from Vivid about what their stance is on this? Because if we reject this today or defer it, and that in some way breaks that relationship that we currently have, and we end up with 230 private units on there, the people of this city are not going to thank us for it.
There was a specific question to Vivid. Could you answer that specific question, please?
Yes, thank you. So Vivid have not seen the viability. We've got nothing to do with that particularly at all. So what we've been doing is looking at this site as a windfall site for us. The viability of the site, even for us, is quite challenging, and that's why we need to put grant into this. Vivid have secured grant from Homes England. It's got nothing to do with this particular application, with City and Country. It's Vivid in its own right. That grant money can be used for additional affordable housing on any site that we're looking at or we're operating on. But we've chosen to apply some of that grant funding to this particular site to bring forward what would be open market units and turn them into affordable. As I say, we had nothing to do with the first application or the viability. We've been working with City and Country on the second application to increase the number of homes and therefore increase the number of affordable homes that we could provide on the site. I guess if you were to refuse this application today and it revert to the previous one, we would have to relook at whether we could still take some of those homes as affordable housing and apply grant to those homes and provide the City of Portsmouth with more homes that are in need.
Councillor Pitt?
I think that answers part of the question. The biggest bit of it for me is, are Vivid able to say, therefore, that whether they get the additional money from Homes England or not, they are committed to delivering the units as affordable? The additional money that they're hoping to receive would enable some of those units to then become social. Is that the difference between where we're at?
So we're looking at the financial viability of the site, of both of the schemes. We're currently following an ODU procurement in tendering for the construction costs, which we expect back next Monday, and then we'll be able to see how much subsidy would need to be put into this scheme in order to make it viable for us.
Councillor Stagg, you had a further question?
Yes, thank you, Joe. Following on from something that Councillor Smythe suggested about the electric charging points, the one thing that looking at the development, the total number of flats, there's no mention at all of using solar panels and cheaper electricity. Now, I've spoken with our energy people who are more than happy to go, and they said they can put solar panels even on the roofs of our flat, because I think it's an opportunity lost if we don't actually make the most of every possible way of having sustainable housing. So can I ask, I think the question I'm asking is, would they be willing to work with our energy department with the building of the flats, the new ones?
Now, you are asking that of the applicant, yes?
I'm not sure, really, but whoever is willing to answer it, really.
May I ask the applicant?
I'll actually probably I think actually deferring it to our delivery partner would probably be the correct answer. I think you need to weigh up the balance of any visual impacts, bearing in mind we've obviously got a listed building at the centre of this, but I think that's a relatively minor point. I think again it comes back to the viability point, that if it works, it's something that could be explored.
If that is the case, I mean, I've spoken to the energy people and they're more than happy to work with whoever, whether it's yourselves or Vivid. And so I can put you in touch, yes. Thank you.
Let's come back to Councillor Stubbs, then Councillor Hooper, then Councillor Pitt.
And reference has been made to the NHS claim for infrastructure money, which as the report says is in any way not for infrastructure. They want to spend it on staff. But I guess there's sort of an underlying feel from the deputations really along the lines of that there shouldn't be any further development in that side of Portsmouth. I mean, that was the fundamental, I think, distilling the point that was made. I'd like to give the officers opportunity to comment on that.
Thank you, Councillor. From a strategic point of view, the local planning authority will work with health providers through the local plan process so that everyone can plan ahead, transport providers, education, health and so on, and that certainly happens at a strategic level with the NHS. So that organisation will know what is in the local plan, it will know what the housing need is, and it will know what sites are allocated for development, and so can be expected to come forward, and it will know the numbers of windfall sites that come forward unexpectedly, and in the round it will know that over a planned period X thousand homes are expected to be delivered. So we work with the health service in that respect strategically, looking ahead. This is slightly different in that an individual request has come in that's now coming in on other sites as well. In this instance, the NHS is looking back rather than forwards, which is one difficulty perhaps in terms of making sure that if we were to be able to levy a contribution, it was done lawfully. That's in respect of planning legislation, as we've said, because they're asking for funding for staffing rather than infrastructure, typically buildings. That doesn't, in our opinion, meet the tests, but we will be happy to engage with them to see if that can be progressed and how we might move on from there. But for the moment, and this is common with lots of other local planning authorities I know, when the request is not made in a lawful manner, or the consequence would be wouldn't be done lawfully in planning terms, the local planning authority can't unfortunately meet it. But as I say, we would be happy to work with them to see what progress could be made.
I mean, on the sort of more sort of general point, so if you think about, well, let's talk about the air quality issues. So reference has been made to some locations in that general area of the city being fairly close to EU limits. How does that work in terms of determining a planning application? I mean, I'm not aware of any instances either here or in other places where applications have been refused on the basis of air quality. Is that an option that's available to the committee, or is it not?
I'll obviously comment only on this application. Mr. Lee is here to answer if things get more technical, sorry. In the round, it's not unusual for a local planning authority, it's not unusual at all to have what appear to be competing interests. Do you allow a couple of trees to be removed in order to make way for another important development? Balancing interests is what happens time and time again in planning, and this is one of those issues along with transportation and services and so on. The local planning authority needs to find new housing to meet the local population's needs, housing needs. It also needs to address the serious air quality issues that face the city. Can those two things be achieved at the same time? We think they can. The air quality issues don't place a moratorium on new development. The air quality plan naturally will take account of known developments. So it would already be taking account of the consented scheme from 2 years ago of 230 units, and if this scheme is approved with an extra 37, it will take account of those extra units and know and model in the effects of that into the wider mitigation strategy that will be developed by the city. So that's a general point in the round about target setting and taking account of new developments. But in this instance, our colleagues have assessed it and don't consider that the scale of the development or its location is such that they recommend refusal.
Councillor Hooper.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just want to touch on a point that Councillor Smith raised a while back. I would like to ask a question in regards to listed buildings and harmonising the old with the new. Is there any kind of obligation the council can enforce to ensure the developer builds the new blocks in keeping with the aesthetic of the original building?
Yes, there's a requirement to take into account the effect of new development on heritage assets, absolutely. And that's always a judgment, and people will have different opinions about a particular site and whether or not the building is too tall or too close or too far away or well enough designed. So the short answer is yes, there is a legal duty to consider the duty to preserve or enhance heritage assets, in this instance listed buildings, as well as the setting of other listed assets outside the site. So that's a process we've gone through that happened with the previous application, which is important because that is effectively the fallback position, as we call it. A previous scheme was consented very similar to this scheme. With respect to the new build blocks, people will have their own opinions, individuals, about whether or not they like the scale and design of them. But these blocks are very similar to what was approved last time. They are in the same position as last time, of the same footprints as last time, and the changes have been limited at height. They're essentially the same design as well, design and materials. The changes are limited at height only, where there's been an equalisation of the buildings and a removal of some of the colonnade features. So it's quite a limited change in the entirety of the whole scheme. Members still need to come to an opinion as to whether or not they're satisfied that the impact of those new buildings would be acceptable. There clearly is an impact, but in terms of the planning application, that impact has to be assessed against the listed buildings, and in the round, what are the other benefits of the development? Bringing forward a site positively for new housing and retaining listed buildings for the future, and all those other benefits. So the buildings have been designed carefully. I think they are trying not to compete too much in terms of their architectural detailing. I think there's a right amount, if I can put it that way. They're not too plain, but they're not too detailed to try and challenge the listed buildings. They're of a good scale, that's for sure, but that scale is needed in order to try and make the site deliverable, and that scale is almost the same as last time. The materials are a greyish that can be very smart, which I think refers back to the listed buildings, matches it quite well. So I think in terms of harmonisation, I think was the word, I think that makes a significant step. So I'm quite confident that along with choosing the materials well with the applicant, and then their construction execution being good, this will make a good development and pay due regard to the listed buildings.
I understand what you're saying about the colour, and that might marry in quite well, but looking at the images on the screen, to me we've got quite an uncomfortable paradox there. You've got essentially what are square boxes that juxtapose horribly with what is quite a beautiful Victorian Gothic building. So I'm afraid I'm not convinced.
Well, that is a matter of opinion, Councillor, and you're entitled to your opinion. Yes, I think I'll just refer back to say I think it might have been a mistake to try and pastiche or replicate to too great a degree some of the ornamentation of the prison buildings, because they are ornate, castellations and turrets and towers and so on. So I think the architects have been careful to keep it a bit plainer. I don't think it's too plain. A bit plainer, just so that they're not challenging too much the listed buildings in terms of scale and design. But that's a judgment that people will make.
Councillor Pitt.
Sorry, Chair, I've been mulling over the answer that we were given by Vivid a little while back, and I'm still not 100% clear. I just need to ask very specifically, are Vivid committed to the site regardless of whether or not they secure additional funding? And is that additional funding purely to enable them to deliver more social housing? So in other words, whatever happens, are Vivid currently in a position to move forward and deliver at least 30% affordable housing, which is our requirement on that site?
That is a specific question to Vivid. Can I have a specific answer?
We're in negotiations with City and Country to buy the land for the new build blocks. We're not in a contractual relationship yet. We're out to tender to inform us on the construction costs, and that will help us decide whether this scheme is viable for us. we need to put subsidy into the scheme to provide the affordable housing. The more subsidy that we can put in, dependent on the costs, will mean that we can provide more social rented homes.
I have asked the city solicitor to comment.
Members, I mean, it may be a matter of great interest to you what Vivid's intentions are, but of course they're not a party to this planning application. They're not going to be subject to the planning application. They're not going to be subject to the 106 agreement. There'll be absolutely nothing whatsoever to compel them to provide any of the social housing on the site. So this is interesting background information, but nothing more.
Councillor Pitt.
Not for the first time, I completely disagree with the city solicitor. That might be your advice, Michael, but nevertheless it is pertinent and very relevant to everyone on this committee what's going to be built there. And if we thought, sat here, that we were just given permission for an extra 37 private dwellings on that site with no affordable housing provision at all, I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that that will have a different outcome than if this committee understands that affordable housing is going to be delivered where previously it wasn't. So it may not be a material consideration, but it flaming well matters to me.
I think you have made your point. Other questions from members? Thank you. My question is, following up on Councillor Pitt's statement, is there anything which we can do to ensure that there will be affordable housing on this site? The answer I get is no.
The Section 106 agreement is presently looking to be drafted with, I suppose, an incentive that in the event that policy were met in terms of on-site provision for affordable housing, not that you can insist upon it because of the situation we're in, the affordable housing contribution would fall by the wayside because there would be adequate provision otherwise. But that's not something you can insist upon because of where we are with this application as a material consideration.
A last call. Any further question? We come to comments. Councillor Pitt, then Councillor Jones.
Well, we're not in a very good position, Chair, are we? Because the viability should absolutely have been shown at the briefings. That's our normal procedure, so I've no idea why it wasn't. However, I'm not aware if yourself or any member of the committee raised the issue as to why the viability assessment wasn't being seen when it's our normal practice that it should be, so I'm pretty bemused by that. We have 230 private dwellings of virtually the same design already agreed for this site, and we have today to decide whether or not, on the balance of probabilities, regardless of the city solicitor's advice, we believe that by granting this application we're going to get a better deal than we've currently got. And I think the risk to refusing the application is huge, because it could potentially blow apart what are obviously negotiations going on between a social housing delivery body and the applicant. So I don't think that that's where we can be today. I am interested to know, and I know it's not normal practice, but since Councillor Jones asked me a direct question earlier on, I'm quite happy to ask her one. Is the, Donna, in your view, is if we look at the viability assessment itself, and it does show exactly what Simon and Sim are saying that it does, have you got other reservations about this?
Councillor Jones.
I've got 4 points. First of all, air quality, and the point that Councillor Stubbs and Councillor Stagg have raised. And, you know, this, I feel quite strongly about this as an elected member representing a city that's extremely densely populated, that has 3 severe breaches in air quality on key junctions, one of which is literally a stone throw from here at Velder Avenue. And I think the government can't have its cake and eat it. You know, they've given us a housing target of almost 19,000, well, no, sorry, 19,500 homes. I know that's coming down slightly, we hope, but it was 19,600 something about 4 or 5 months ago. But yet, saying to us, if you don't bring nitrogen dioxide levels down in certain key junctions of the city, we are going to take, you know, action against you. We're going to penalise you. We may well fine you. And it's like saying, I've got a little wooden rowing boat. Councillor Mason, you are not allowed to let it sink, but you must. I'm going to keep making you put people in that boat, but you mustn't let it sink. And if you do, I'm going to fine you. They can't have their cake and eat it. Either help us to improve air quality by putting electric charging points around the city and giving us the grants they promised us previously. Blooming well improve the train service to London and all around the south coast, and improve the motorway and extend the smart motorway all the way to Portsmouth and not stop it at Fareham, which is a preposterous idea from Highways England. So I feel quite strongly about the air quality issue. I wish there was precedent set nationally where there had been planning applications that had been rejected on air quality basis, because then that would really make the government sit up, wouldn't it? Their housing crisis they're saying we've got over the next 20 to 30 years in the United Kingdom, versus them putting their money where their mouth is to actually help us out of the holes that we're in. So, you know, that for me is a real conundrum that it's not just Conservative government, all governments have got to get their head around, but they can't have their cake and eat it. I don't think Portsmouth should be the test case on that at the High Court, because it will cost us a lot of money, into the millions, but I really hope that another council does that at some point so we can piggyback off of them. Secondly, in the application, we're asked today to consider the partial loss of that listed wall to accommodate N block. I think that's entirely appropriate. I don't see any particular issue with that. I know that wall is listed, and I'm sure that there are wall enthusiasts who really like it. I think it's really oppressive. It's a 5 metre high grey, you know, I wouldn't, if I was living in Bowler Avenue and that was potentially coming down and I was living in one of the terraced houses facing it, I'd be thinking, hallelujah. So I don't have an issue with that part of what we're being asked to agree today. Then coming on to the point actually that Councillor Hooper made, and for me, specifically PCS 23 and PCS 15, and that is you know, if my proposal today for deferral on for 10 days, 2 weeks, however long it might be, just for us to get our heads around the viability, which I'm going to come back to at the end as Councillor Pitts raised that, if that had fallen today, or if it does fall today, I would have considered putting forward a refusal based on PCS 23 and PCS 15, and that is the design of those blocks. Until I heard from the planning officer, the case officer, that actually this is the same design as those agreed back in 2017. And actually, on that basis, glancing towards Kieran on this one, but if we were to refuse it on the design of how those new blocks look, would that be upheld, considering there is an existing consent from this same planning authority for that design? I think it might put us in a bit of a conundrum there. But from my perspective, they don't add to that listed building. And when you look at the officer's report, and particularly in reference to those policies, it actually does make some really, really good points. And it says that around PCS 23, the National Planning Policy Framework requires local planning authorities to consider the significance of heritage assets and take account of the desirability of sustaining and enhancing the significance of the assets and putting them to viable uses consistent with their conservation. Now, the blocks themselves and the purpose of them as residential, I don't actually have much of an issue with. It's just the way they look. Are they really enhancing? For me, it's like having a Victorian prison and now looking at modern day prison blocks built alongside them. I don't think they look very nice. I think they could do far more to enhance, as Councillor Hooper said, that very beautiful Gothic style Victorian building. And then on page 80 at the top, again with reference to PCS 23, the policy seeks excellent architectural quality in new buildings. Is this really excellent architectural quality alongside what is a really beautiful building in our very cramped and densely populated city? No, they're not excellent at all. I'm not saying that they are poor. I mean, you know, they are what they are. They're blocks of flats. That's how they look now when they're 3, 4, 5, 6 stories high. But considering they're alongside such a beautiful building, if I was living in Milton Road and looking at those, or Bowler Avenue, I think that they could be built more sympathetic without being pastiche. I take on board planning officer's point. You can't make it look pastiche. It would look awful. It would look like, you know, Disneyland or something. But, you know, I think it could be done much more sympathetically to, yes, reflect a modern design, because they will be newly built blocks, but still to be slightly more in keeping with that very beautiful building that you have, particularly at the Gatehouse. Sadly, I don't think a refusal on PCS 23 and PCS 15 would withstand the Planning Inspectorate's stringent view, because we have already granted permission in the first place for similar designs. So on that basis, I won't put that forward. Finally, my last point on the social housing. Look, the private sector can't make this work. You know, the owners of this site have done some outstanding developments across the UK in the private sector, and I'm sure if they could have made this work from a private sector perspective, they would have already got on with it by now, and wouldn't therefore then be talking at selling land at a reduced value to a social housing provider such as Vivid. So I am 90% sure that this will end up being a social housing scheme. But the point I'm trying to make here, and particularly for the future and setting a precedent going forward, is that, you know, this committee, as I've said already, made a stance about the viability that we want to see that previously. It's not a material part of the planning application in terms of demonstrating to us the fact that Section 106 is our fallback position if the grant is not made. I'm simply asking not for a refusal today, but a deferral, so that we are satisfied as committee members that if we grant this application with the worded Section 106 that Kieran has indicated today, that we are happy. I mean, I particularly would love to see what land value was given to Savills for this site, because I know that they got this site for basically nothing because they bought the other one. So I'd love to see what land values have gone in there. And I'm not saying it would turn it into a plus figure. I'm sure that, you know, this is a tricky building to develop, but I would just like to see those figures to satisfy ourselves. So I put forward once again my proposal for a deferral based on the Section 106 condition and the viability.
Right. Do we have a seconder for that? Councillor Udi had your finger up first. Would you like to speak?
So, I really like the design of the buildings. I went to see the site on Monday because I never got to go around during the open weekend, and I really wanted to see the prison. I lived down St Mary's Road for 20 years of my life, so I saw it from my front room pretty much every day, because I'm really close to where it was. I don't live there anymore. I don't have an interest, by the way, like by living close to it. No, not exactly. Anyway, whilst I like the design of the buildings, and pretty much I trust that Vivid are going to do something with this site, I think it's going to happen. There is huge questions around viability, which I'll get back to in just 2 seconds. We need to talk about air pollution here. Absolutely. So I worked at the Baffins pub for a long period of time and lived in Southsea and commuted and got the bus. So I know all about the traffic down like Baffins Roadway, going into Milton. Like, if it's during rush hour, sometimes it would be quicker for me to walk home to Southsea. And you're telling me there is dangerous air pollution in Copner and then down at Velder Avenue. Is there not air pollution in the middle either? Like, Councillor Jones, I always said your first name there, mentioned about this being a test case. I think maybe we should throw our money into it, because I feel like it could happen with the St James's development as well, because we're going to be arguing on the exact same points on this. We're going to have more cars, yet we can refuse for having less parking spaces. We need less parking spaces because we need to tell people not to have cars. We need better transport links, saying that it's only 15 minutes to walk to Fratton train station, so people can do that or ride their bike or whatever, because there is a safe passage over St Mary's Bridge though now, which there wasn't for about 15 years of my life. It was like this thin walking to Milton Cross School. It was ridiculous. Other than that, on the viability assessment, could we ask for, don't we normally get Val Williams in to scrutinise these viability assessments? Can't we ask for that as well on part of the deferral, that it's scrutinised? But Savills,
Savills were appointed as independent assessors to provide an independent check on the viability of the site, so that they are independent. So I would say there's no need to have another independent check of an independent assessment.
That's fine. Thank you for clarifying that. So yeah, I think we need to talk about air pollution, because I don't think, as much as I love this development, I really do. I think it's really great. You're moving in a whole new town's worth of people into somewhere where traffic is bad, air pollution is literally killing people, and we're fighting the government because they're going to penalise us for not building more homes, but then we're going to have more air pollution, so we're going to have more homes for more people, but we're just going to die sooner in them anyway. So we really need to talk about this. Yes. Oh, that was good to get off, wasn't it? And I was sat, I was for 2 hours. Cheers. And Donna's, Councillor Jones's deferral.
Okay, so you've seconded her referral. Her deferral was, however, only for the viability assessment. That was the grounds for deferral, correct? Right.
Sorry, Chair, can I just make a point? The wider issues you've raised about housing numbers, links with air pollution, etc., etc., that is the type of discussion we'll take forward with the local plan review, because that will get the addressed by an independent inspector. So we take that out of the arena of discussing this specific application.
Unless there was another alternative. Yeah. Okay, we have had a deferral proposed and seconded. Does anybody wish to make an alternative proposal, a further different proposal? Councillor Smythe I saw first, then Councillor Pitt, Councillor Stubbs.
Thank you, Chair. I wondered if we could deal with the viability in terms of a condition. I must confess that I did go on Monday evening, and we did have a conversation about the Savills independent report, and I'm pretty confident that the first planning committee I came to, we looked at the viability report, which was brought back later, and I was reassured enough at what the officers said about the fact that the deficit has gone down, and that Savills had given a new advice not to ask. And in retrospect, perhaps I should have asked and insisted on that, and I apologise to everybody that I didn't make a point of that in the prior meeting. So I was wondering if we could suggest a condition on that we are satisfied with that when we see it, and also the condition on the electric car charging points, which I think should become part of our local plan in future for any substantial new developments. So, I mean, if we were to condition those two, I would move as far as to propose approval.
Now, I need to take advice on that, because it is possible, certainly, to make a condition on electric car charging points. Is it possible to put a condition with relation to the viability assessment?
Would be, Chair, that we were a majority of us was satisfied with what we've seen from it, because it's already been obtained.
Half moment. I'm going to get legal advice on that point, and then I'll come to you, Councillor Jones. Members, Councillor Pitt, my advice is that I have from the legal team is that it would be improper of us to have a deferral, to approve and try to insist as a condition that we were satisfied with a document which has not been produced to us. That this is not possible. Councillor Jones, then Councillor Pitt.
Is that with regards to the electric charging points? That's with regards to the... Okay, because the electric charging points, Councillor Stubbs and I believe that that's not possible because we don't have a policy from which to hang that refusal on. However, here's another alternative to Councillor Smythe's proposal. Because we are due to receive Section 106, SIL payment monies as a council from the development upon completion, is it legally permitted for us to state that some of that SIL payment should be spent installing electric charging points on the site? Because then it's the council using some of their SIL payment to do that.
Yes, we can make that as a recommendation. Councillor Pitt.
Following slightly down the lines of Councillor Smythe's proposal, we've had a statement made in this meeting by the lead planning officer who's been looking after this application that there is a current deficit of a specific total in this scheme shown in the viability assessment. Would it not be possible to condition the application as granted subject to the viability assessment being published and confirming that figure?
I'm grateful for the opportunity to clarify. The rules changed in the MPPF or MPPG last summer. Prior to then, the applicant would have submitted their development appraisal, their sums of their scheme, and invariably it would have been a private commercial document. Members, if they had asked to see it, probably would have been allowed to see it depending on the council's approach, but not to take it away or have a copy. The rules changed last summer, and all viability assessments now must be published to the web. This is the applicant's development appraisal, their sums. That happened in this instance. This viability development appraisal came in and was published to the web back in November, December time. So that information is there and it's publicly available for some months now. We have gone on to appoint Savills to carry out an independent appraisal of the developer's sums. They have gone through the report, as I've set out briefly in my report. As you would expect, I've got to summarise things to a certain degree. But they've gone through the development appraisal, of the applicant's development appraisal, each section, testing each element. Was the land value paid correct? Are the sales values they're expecting to get correct or within a reasonable margin? Are the construction costs correct over that period of time? Are the contingency costs correct? Are the professional fees correct? Are the interest rates and lending correct? They've tested each and every element of the applicant's public development appraisal. Where they've agreed with it, they've said so. Where they've said that's a bit high or a bit low, they've said so, but it's within normal grounds. They've adjusted one or two elements, like the sales period, I think it was, by a few months. But there have been very minor adjustments. So they've tested each element and come forward to the conclusion that yes, it is around about 11 million deficit. So, I mean, that is the summary that I can provide you. The document can be available, because I have checked that, for members, but that is a summary that I hope is helpful for members. Every element has been tested and verified and agreed effectively.
Councillor Pitt.
It seems to me that if we defer this on the basis that we want confirmation of the viability assessment, we're saying that we don't believe our planning officer, and we against a document that's in the public domain and has been for quite a long time. I think that potentially makes us look a bit stupid, to be honest. If we haven't read it, that's actually technically our fault, although it should have been included in the papers for today. So I think that changes things, and I'm going to propose the officer's recommendations.
Do I have a seconder for the officer's recommendations? Or to allow it? Yes, Councillor Smythe has seconded that. Councillor Jones?
Just to clarify, no slight on my take at all on the officer's professional opinion. I don't believe it's him that have provided the information, or he's not the expert that has, from Savills, the surveyor who has come back and verified it. I am drawing into question here, as I said previously, the value of the site that was being put into that financial appraisal. Also, I will say, as a pretty well-informed councillor on this council, having been leader of this council before, I wasn't aware that these were now being publicly published. This hasn't been going on for a long time. This is not something that's gone on for a long time. I'm on the website now getting it up so I can have a look at it. I would like to propose a 10-minute adjournment so that we can open the document, all those of us that want to, and have a look, because it might be that a quick conversation with the applicant can satisfy a number of my questions, and then I may be able to remove my deferral. But at this point, I think it would be remiss of this committee not to be satisfying ourselves on the viability, because that then sets a precedent for other applications going forward. And there is definitely a point to note here for the planning development control team, that where something is so important and it is so based on viability, it must form a material part of the report. This coming up as a curveball at the 11th hour is really not, even if it is published online. They never used to be.
Right. There has been a proposal that we shall have a 10-minute deferral so that people may examine material which is available.
Councillor Mason, so we do that so no, we're not all looking at it on mobile devices. Can we request, is it possible to request that the planning officers print off a copy and that we could use, have we got a room? Yeah, I know, yeah. So I completely agree with Councillor Jones's proposition. I think it's sensible as well and doesn't necessarily waste everyone's time coming back in 2 weeks to look at a document that we should have been told was there in the first place. But if we could all get a copy and go somewhere, and so that the public who are here today to give deputations are aware of what's going on, I suggest that we adjourn for 45 minutes to allow that to happen.
I mean, can I make a counterpoint on that, really, which is, I mean, I'm personally fairly relaxed about whether we review this document or not, because £11.5 million is about £50,000 per unit, and I seriously doubt it's that much out. But I'm obviously happy to do that if other members wanted to. But if we're going to do that, I think we are probably going to have to look at rescheduling this onto the next planning committee meeting in 2 weeks' time. And if that is something we're going to end up doing, I would very much like to hear from Vivid Homes and the applicant about their position on that, and also to clarify with officers whether the effect of doing that will be that all other matters in this application would be considered agreed.
Thank you, Councillor Stubbs. It has, however, been proposed by Councillor Jones and seconded by Councillor Pitt that we should have an adjournment to consider documents which will be printed off in the next 5 to 10 minutes for our benefit, and then we will be in a position to come to a firmer conclusion, I would hope. Those in favour of the adjournment, please indicate. Those against the adjournment, please indicate.
How long are we adjourning?
How long will you need to get this?
Well, we can get it printed off in the Lord Mayor's office, probably.
Okay.
Half an hour.
I suggest, therefore, that we have a half-hour adjournment. This will be printed off in the Lord Mayor's office and will be made available to members at the earliest opportunity. We stand adjourned. Thank you.
Chair, I know we're reading, but this isn't the Savills report. This is the developer's report. Where's the Savills report?
Members, if I could have your attention. By error, you were provided with the BNP Paribas report and not the Savills report, which was what I believe you requested. The situation is that we can produce the Savills report. It is a 20-page report. 1 or 2 lines, if this is going to be in public session, would have to be redacted, but we can produce it with that modification, should you so wish.
Can I make a recommendation that we have it up on the OHP from the officer's computer instead, because this is actually quite a useful document, but I do agree with Councillor Pitt, it would be useful to see the independent experts report as we have paid for it. This is quite useful, this page.
Yeah. Councillor Stubbs.
Would it be possible to ask through you, Chair, for the representative from Vivid Homes, could you ask whether there would be a difficulty for them were we to defer this item for 2 weeks to the next committee agenda?
If that is the will of the other people to ask that. Members, does anybody support Councillor Stubbs, who wishes to see whether Vivid would have a problem about a 2-week deferral? Councillor Pitt.
Chair, I don't think you need a seconder for Councillor Stubbs to ask Vivid a question. I could be wrong, but I think he can ask the question and then we can decide what we think of the answer.
Okay. Vivid, how would you feel about a 2-week deferral?
I mean, clearly I'm not the applicant here.
Okay.
And I guess we are all here, though, now, in this room. I mean...
There's a general... Now, I hear murmurings, let's get it done. Since we have the Savills report on the screen, is that acceptable to members?
It is, Chair, but we were told there might have to be a couple of sentences redacted.
Yeah.
Presumably that's not possible if it's on the screen. Helpful.
Can you take us through the salient points with
without that matter.
Thank you, Chairman. The report provided was the report requested, which was the developer's appraisal, which was on the website. Savills has been requested as well, and that's helpful, so here it is. It is much more digestible. The developer's appraisal, not just this one, but typically a developer's appraisal is a very dry technical document that is hard to follow, and that's the value of having an independent consultant who will assess it and put it into not layman's terms, but more understandable and more digestible terms, which is what I think I said to you earlier on about the confidence I had in the appraisal done by Savills. It says strictly private and confidential. I did check that a few days ago, and they confirmed there was one element of it that I will endeavour not to put on the screen. Otherwise, the rest is acceptable for public consumption. Now, I'm not a surveyor, I'm a town planner, but I do have experience of viability appraisals, and I'm greatly assisted by having one that has been done very well, in my opinion. So I'll do my best to take you through it. I think I'll go straight to the costs and values. They're the main elements as opposed to principles. One of the first elements was looking at the cost of the site, which Councillor Jones mentioned earlier. That is not anything near the total construction costs, which I think are £49 million. So Savills correctly rehearsed this, looking at financial viability assessments in general there, and the next page looking at benchmarks, and here looking at existing use value, current use value, and debating effectively what approach to take. Should you take a market approach to the existing use value of this site, or what is the existing use? A former prison, almost nil. And then they moved on to actually the market approach is, well, it has a planning consent from a couple of years ago, so we should be looking at the value of the site with a residential land value, which is here. And it's at the bottom of that page. I can't go any further on that page, that's the confidential bit. But towards the bottom here, the former Drayton Dairy, just there in the last couple of lines, if you can see that. Obviously, any appraisal will go and look at actual examples locally to provide a benchmark, and how much did that land go for. The next paragraph, which is confidential, is the value of the land there, which was significantly different from what the applicant paid. And they also looked at Parkhurst in London, a former MOD prison. And then they looked at the value of the land, the price that the applicant paid for this. Now, the applicant bought 5 sites at the same time, which was mentioned earlier, and they apportioned... So, I'm sorry, I'm getting muddled up with Pentonville, aren't I? Parkhurst. And here, if I can find it, 3.39, this is looking at SIL viability, urban land index and so on, and at the bottom of that paragraph there, they think this site could have been worth about £5.84 million. Actually, the applicant paid less than £1 million for it. So they paid significantly less than you might have expected, which if they paid the £5.8 million, that would have put them even further into deficit in the appraisal. So the consultant thought it was fair and reasonable and reflecting reality to take the £1 million site purchase, not another value that could have been applied, and that wasn't in the applicant's favour. If they spent much more, their scheme would have gone even further into deficit on paper. So the applicants were happy with the £1 million that the developer's appraisal had input. That's in front of you. That's a relatively, it's not an insignificant cost, but it's a relatively small cost compared to construction costs. The most sensitive issues are sales values, and so any appraisal will go through sales values elsewhere to get some benchmarks, if I can find the right one. Here we are, comparable evidence. looking at sales values. And we get on to actual examples locally. Hippodrome House, Guildwalk in Portsmouth. That's an example of some values achieved there. So they're real values, pounds per square foot. Here are some above, and achieved price. So there's some actual land values, that sales values that you can benchmark against the appraisal. And here are a whole further set, a gumball of keys. So in a normal way, the consultant goes through and says, this is what's achieved locally. Do these compare with the values that the applicant has put in their development appraisal? Yes, they do.
Are they comparing with places in Baffins or nearby? Because Guildhall Walk and HMS Prison at Kingston are not really comparable in my mind.
Well, they've chosen, they've got the Vulcan Neptune Court as well. The Vulcan is a good comparable because it was a former Grade 2 listed, former armour building Grade 2 listed in a good location. So they're trying to, every site is a bit different location-wise and character-wise in itself. And so they try and select a range that will give a feeling. It's not an exact science, but some helpful comparables to see if the values, the sale values that the applicant says they're expecting are a reasonable estimation. So they've done some other sites locally to give some actual comparables.
Councillor Pitt.
Normal practice with viability assessments is that the person making the judgment on the appropriateness of the values that have been assigned for the properties will use basically the internet and recent sale histories online to look up the first part of the postcode and the number from the second part of the postcode, and then take an average of those properties. Now that's not an exact science either, because for example, as we saw in the Queen's Hotel application a while back, if that particular property happened to have sea views, but was about 300-400 yards away from a whole bunch of properties that were divided up into HMOs and bedsits. So that was skewing it in the other direction. Has that style of modelling been used on this, or is it all just looking at a series of different options?
I think they've also looked at city-wide data, if I'm reading this correctly, flats and maisonettes within Portsmouth, stated by the Land Registry. So they've looked at that as well as specific sites. So it's a combination of the two, Councillor, I think. So the sales values is clearly a massive part of the scheme, and they have deemed to be within an acceptable range and acceptably correct. That's construction costs. Right at the bottom, it would appear that the figure adopted by BNP remains optimistic, and therefore we have maintained it for the time being. There, they thought construction costs might be a bit lower than Savills were expecting. Again, that's not in the applicant's favour. Normally it's the other way around in development appraisal, where they're seeking to show something might be less viable than it actually would be. So that's why I think I have some confidence in the figures and the appraisal from Savills. They've gone through in this table here to look at all the other elements. Contingency. They've noted contingency is higher for listed buildings, so they're happy with the 7.5%. I won't pretend to understand every element in the table. Professional fees at 12%, they felt that was on balance reasonable. SIL allowance they've factored in. There it's 2.293. On the left, that's in the developer's appraisal. That's been adjusted to 2.5, so that's been put in by Savills into their estimations. And the last perhaps thing to look at is timescales is important as well with costs and returns, and they made a slight adjustment here. We would expect a slightly longer sales period than 12 months, so they've adjusted that. So I was confident that they'd looked at every single variable and commented, as I said earlier, that either that's correct, it was within a reasonable range, or we've corrected it. And then they carried out the sensitivity analysis at the end. which is very small, but that is a crucial table that deals with increases, changes in prices. I don't know if I can enlarge this. Still not small.
It's too big size.
I'm afraid it's not coming out very well, but that table is crucial. That sets out different scenarios. Because of the timescale of the development and sales, what happens if during that period sales values increase or decrease, or construction costs increase or decrease, and they've tested each one of those variables against each other to see what effect that has on the scheme. And with a 5% change in one of those, that can have a significant effect. It's called the sensitivity test, and that is why we have a review mechanism at the end, so that if any of those things change in the applicant's favour, and if the scheme therefore becomes viable, affordable housing is realised.
Questions, Councillor Jones?
In the report we've got here from BNP Paribas, it was quite useful, this table that I showed to Councillor Pitt, but actually I realised after I started working through the numbers, page 11 of the document that looks like that at the front.
Yep.
This one, having started to work through the numbers, I realise it then says above it, table 5.2.1, consented scheme appraisal assumptions. So that's actually for the old one and not for the new one, therefore, I'm assuming. Is that right? So actually the stuff that you printed out for us was the appendice and the original BNP report, which is on the scheme that's already got permission and not the new one. Yeah, but when you go through it, it's nowhere near as useful as that table, and that table's really, really good. So, appreciate that Savills haven't necessarily laid it out like that. So, can I ask you some questions so that I can directly correlate it back to here? So, the in this first part of the table, it has the market housing revenue assumptions for a studio, a 1-bed, a 2-bed and a 3-bed. Could you tell me what Savills settled on as their studio, 1-bed, 2-bed and 3-bed market sale value, and also what the applicant fed into the process? So what the applicant said they would be worth on the new revised scheme 2 years later based on 267 units, and what Savills ended on.
It's a slightly difficult question for me to answer, not being a surveyor. I don't think they've ended up, well, as you can see, first of all, on the table you identified, Councillor, on page 11, I think it's helpful in that it sets out in the middle column 2016 appraisal input, and then the right-hand column is the 2018, so it's trying to show how things have changed in the 2 years. And as you can see,
so that's what they fed in, because this is their report, the applicants, this is not the Savills one. So, okay, so we've got the most recent thing then leading up to the end of 2018 from the applicant, the 3-bed flat that would go there at 380, 190, and the 2-bed at 273, etc. So what did Savills agree with those figures? I think from what you're saying, they did.
in the round, yes.
Yes, okay, fine. Right, so on to the next question then. The construction costs. So £48,192,962, including that increase of 10.5%, which I assume is for CPI or whatever. So did Savills agree with that cost?
Yes, that's the cost they said was a little bit optimistic, i.e. they would expect it to be a bit higher, i.e. the developer was being more than fair.
Thank you very much.
Other questions, members? Councillor Pitt.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of challenging viability assessments, it's my understanding that the developer is allowed, under normal circumstances, what's agreed to be fair and reasonable is that they would make a profit of 20%, and that the lowest figure, under normal circumstances, there are exceptions, but the lower figure would be 15%. Are Savills happy that that falls within this range?
That's correct, Councillor. That's a typical range. The input here was 20%, as it happens, so everyone was happy with that.
Councillor Jones.
What's holding cost? Is that to secure the site? I mean, what does holding cost mean? It doesn't, in the explanation, it doesn't really...
I'm afraid I don't know, Councillor, but I think it's a relatively limited part of the appraisal, not a major factor.
700,000.
Yeah.
Can we ask the applicant maybe, if that's okay?
Do you happen to know what a holding cost is, so you can advise them?
Yes, absolutely. So I think the Councillor's question was not necessarily the figure, but in terms of what would make up a traditional holding cost. So page 17 of the Savills report refers to a couple of obvious items relating to security, hoardings, maintenance, fuel, asbestos, obviously. So all the items that really we're duty bound to deal with since we've purchased the property, which was at the end of 2014. So it's quite a time period. Oh, sorry, and Savills agreed.
Thank you very much for that explanation. Councillor Jones.
I'm sure there are more questions. I'm ready for my comment when you're on to that section.
Further questions on any section? Councillor Jones, do you have any further? Okay. Councillor Pitt, question.
Kind of a question, I guess, for Simon to confirm. In real terms, if we were to turn this down, with the profit margin showing at 20% and us having done our own independent appraisal with Savills, would we stand a very good chance at losing at appeal or not, in your professional opinion?
I'm confident in the professional opinion that's been advanced to us, and 20% is market norm. And I'm confident in the way that Savills have approached it, so I would not wish to try and defend a refusal on those grounds.
Councillor Smythe, question. Councillor Pitt, question.
It is the case that these appraisals, neither the Savills appraisal or the one that we've got from Bank BNP Paribas, shows the consequences of Vivid buying the site and putting 100% affordable housing on 65% of the site. That's right, isn't it?
That's right, because this is an application, as we've explained, Vivid, and whatever separate arrangements the applicant may come to with another provider, that is separate. This is an application. Planning permission runs with the land. So it's not connected to an applicant in 999 times out of 1,000. And the same principle applies to a market appraisal for any developer of this site, and that is what is in front of us. So anything else that may be done separately doesn't feed in unless it becomes apparent later on in the review mechanism.
Thank you. That was just a preliminary to the actual question, really, which is that if we always put in a option to review the viabilities when these at various points during the scheme, so that we don't miss, we can't be done out of what we should have here as a contribution in lieu of affordable housing or affordable housing. Is it the case that if Vivid do go ahead with their purchase of all the new blocks, that such a review of this viability would be called for anyway?
I've not been through the process from start to finish, but I would anticipate, as I talked about earlier, the appraisal points, the review points, I should say, start to reflect what's actually happened. Once you're halfway through development, you know how much the construction points have been up to that point, and any other costs and values. So I expect that any other transactions that happen would be then reflected at one of the review points. There are probably two along the way, and then the final review. So I would expect for those sorts of circumstances to be reflected.
To the point that the applicant would be able to not pay the SIL contribution because they were in effect providing 65% affordable housing on the land, or not?
Now, the SIL contribution is non-negotiable and separate. We're just talking about the affordable housing potential.
Councillor Pitt.
Yes, just a bit of clarification around what would happen if this application was refused. What weight would the regional inspector give to the existing application for 230 units and that viability assessment that supported that grant 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, in relation to the additional 37 units on this site? I mean, we're in a slightly unusual position because normally we're just looking at each application on its merits. I guess I'm asking, will the inspector do that, or will they say, well, they've already granted permission for 230 units and this is asking for another 37 units and the viability still stands up to independent scrutiny, so therefore there's no case to answer at appeal and they can have their application? Where do we stand?
I expect the inspector would assess this scheme if viability were the reason for refusal on this scheme alone, because it's a different scheme to 2016, somewhat different. We've seen that from the figures that are produced. So I would expect the inspector to consider alone the development appraisal and viability of this scheme.
Members, thank you for your questions. We now need to come to towards a decision. There were, prior to the break, two propositions before us. One was for deferral, and one was for acceptance of the officer's recommendation. I think in the light of the discussion which we have had and the documents which you have before you, it would be sensible to say that that was made on less information than we have available now, and therefore they do not stand. And so I would ask members to accept that and to make new proposals. Councillor Jones, then Councillor Pitt.
Well, I mean, I have made my proposal. We're still in the meeting. It hasn't ended. So if, you know, I'll come to my comments in a minute about whether or not I withdraw it. But at the moment, it's still on the table. Having looked through all of this information, and I have to say this has been particularly useful, going down the list, the market house revenue, average sales per unit price, I have to say I think seem good. Some of them I think are slightly optimistic even, actually. So I think that's I have no issue with that at all whatsoever on the 57,372,000 that they've estimated there. Ground rents are what they are. The construction costs, I do have potentially a bit of an issue with, and this could be slightly my own layman's naivety, but at the moment, working on 48 million, it's crudely £180,000 per unit. I know some are bigger than others, some are brand new, some are in listed buildings, so obviously I am taking this at a very, very high level, obviously, and I do think on the face of it, that seems a bit high for some units, but then for others it could actually be quite good value, as Savills have said. Contingency at 7.5%, I think that seems fair enough. Holding costs, well, I did have a question mark next to that, but when you factor in that this site has been owned by the organisation since 2013, fair enough. The VAT, yeah, well, you know, £500 per unit is not a huge amount, is it? Professional fees at 12%, I would have expected that to be between 5 and 10, but again, it's a big site, it's not straightforward, so okay, it's a 2% maybe higher than I would have liked to have seen it. The SIL, well, disappointingly, the SIL's now projected to have gone down by 400k, but of course we're not going to argue about the SIL payment in there. The sales and marketing fees, I'm sure selling that kind of site, you'd have your on-site office, and I would have expected that to have been less than 1.5%, but whatever, never mind. Again, we're talking about splitting hairs here. Developer's profit is accepted at 20%, so we can't do anything about that, and finance at 7%, I think, is entirely reasonable. So based on the construction cost really is the only one that I think a little bit about. And even if you took it at bargain basement value, say considering it is a listed building at say 120 grand per unit, that's a £32 million construction cost. That makes overall the bottom line, well, it makes a £16 million better differential, but then once you've taken off the £11 million running loss they have said they were going to lose, there might be £5 million in it. I'm sure there probably won't be, because I'm sure that 120,000 is me being naive because I don't work in the construction industry, but knowing what you can build for £120,000 if you're not in listed buildings, I think it's right and proper, particularly from the public's perspective, to justify any decisions we make today that I needed to give that consideration. And bearing in mind we could be talking here about £5 million give or take, and I'm sure that if you build in the fact that it is a listed building, that it's not straightforward, it's complicated, there could be other issues uncovered when you start knocking the listed prison about, then actually I don't see that we've got any justification today based on viability, sadly, to refuse this. So I will withdraw my proposal.
Councillor Pitt.
I was going to offer that we both withdraw our proposals and start again, but given the fact that Donna's just withdrawn hers, it seems a bit of a moot point, so I'm quite happy for mine to stand on that basis. I propose the officer's recommendations.
Propose the officer's recommendation, and your seconder was Councillor Smythe. Are there any other proposals?
This is on the basis that Section 106, we have to be absolutely sure that we are going to keep on top of it and not put it in a filing cabinet and lose it like we often do as a council. We need to be on top of this. We are all going to be keeping a close eye on this, because if that grant funding from Homes England falls, then we seriously need to sit down again. And look, I'm not saying that this is a private sector-led scheme anyway. If it was, I'm sure that the applicant would have done this in a different way. But if we do want this to come forward, I think we need to be, mature and be working with the developer as a council, and we definitely need to be keeping an eye on this because it's a big scheme.
Now, one question which was raised earlier was on electric charging points. Would you wish the Section 106 to include electric charging points as part of the travel plan?
It's the SIL.
Sorry?
It's SIL, not Section 106.
Councillor, there's a number of ways you can do that. For other sites, we have used Section 106 to secure electric charging points, I understand. Or you could do it through SIL. Both are valid options.
Councillor Pitt.
Well, actually, I was going to add to what Donna said just now, because I totally agree with her, and that is that there are review points in the process of this, and I think that we should have a report that comes at those review points, whatever the findings of that are, that a report is presented to the chair, and that the chair briefs the members of the planning committee, whoever they are at that point, on what those findings are, to make sure that that's not something that's going to end up stuck in a filing cabinet. So if Donna wants to actually propose that, that formally does happen and gets noted in the minutes today, I'm happy to second it.
Would you accept that? Okay, and that's accepted. Councillor Smythe.
I'd like to comment that the SIL is meant to be for neighbourhood projects and community projects. If we're going to put this in as a part of our standard planning requirements as soon as we get the local plan done, I also believe it will help them to market their scheme. It's not really a SIL use, actually. It's a 106.
Well, I think that was why it has been suggested might be Section 106 might be more appropriate in the transport. Okay. Agree.
So can we confirm with minuting that the Section 106 agreement ought to include reference to the provision of electric charging points?
Right. Any further comments before I move to the vote? Okay, you have one proposal before you, proposed by Councillor Pitt and seconded by Councillor Smythe, that we accept the officer's recommendation with certain... Sorry? Sorry? With the updated conditions, yes. Okay, yes, I was going to... It's all right. I wasn't going to miss those out. With the updated conditions concerning the Section 106 agreement. Those in favour, please show. Those against, please show. That is carried. You have your planning permission, sir, and I would like to, before members, we have one more thing to do, Councillor Udi. Councillor Udi, you're running away too soon. I know you have, but it won't take very long. We have now to give listed building consent. Do you want a SMAT update on that? Right, there will be a SMAT update from the officer on listed building consent.
Thank you, Chairman. The main reports published last week just noted that the removal of listed wall at Block N hadn't been finally resolved, and that remains the case. But it's a small point, and I'm confident that we can resolve that easily with the applicant. So I just wanted to clear delegated authority to complete that process post today's decision, please.
Right. Can I propose that we give delegated authority to the officers to deal with that? All in favour, please show. Thank you. Are there any further comments before we come to the listed building consent? No? Listed building consent, those in favour, please show. Those against? Did you abstain, Councillor? No, sorry. Oh, sorry. Oh, you're more important matters. Okay. So that is unanimous. So thank you very much, members, for the courtesy you've shown to the chair, and thank you very much to the officers for your patience.